Nhưng mà vì cái thời gian và cái nội dung chiều hôm nay cũng khá dài, cho nên chúng tôi xin phép sẽ bắt đầu luôn. Chiều hôm nay thì chúng ta sẽ tập trung vào một số các cái điểm chính. Đấy là tiếp tục Agotos sẽ trình bày đến các anh chị các cái loại sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp và các cái điểm mạnh, điểm yếu của các cái sản phẩm. Đồng thời là chiều hôm nay sẽ có một cái phần rất là thú vị và quan trọng, đấy là anh Altos sẽ trình bày đến chúng ta cái kinh nghiệm quốc tế về bảo hiểm nông nghiệp. Thì sáng nay một số anh chị hỏi rất nhiều về các kinh nghiệm quốc tế, thì chiều nay có thể tham khảo rất là nhiều từ cái bài trình bày của anh Altos, và chúng ta có thể đặt thêm các câu hỏi. Thì sau đấy sẽ có một phần trình bày về một cái sản phẩm của bảo hiểm lúa gạo đã được Bộ Tài chính công nhận và triển khai hiện nay ở Việt Nam. Thì chúng tôi sẽ trình bày một số các điểm chính để các anh chị có thể nắm được. Thì sau đây xin mời anh Atos tiếp tục chương trình của mình. Xin trân trọng cảm ơn anh các chị.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody after the lunch break. I hope you had a nice lunch break. Okay, so I will basically resume from where we stopped before lunch, which was on looking at the different options for indemnity insurance. So we covered some of the key considerations or key pros and cons related to crop, livestock, and aquaculture. So in the next slide, we'll start looking at yield index insurance. So already in some of the discussion we were having before the break, we talked about index insurance as one of the product categories, also in the context of managing moral hazard and rent-seeking behavior and so on. So in one of the categories of index insurance, and there are a few categories we'll go through in this section, but one of the categories is yield index insurance. So what is yield index insurance? Yield index insurance is essentially a type of index insurance where the index is based on the average yield that a group of farmers have experienced. So maybe we can think about it a little bit as in a different way, like maybe to make it more interesting, that let's say I see there's about 31 of us on this call right now. So let's imagine all 31 of us were farmers, rice farmers in a particular area in Vietnam, in the same village. Now, whereas with indemnity insurance, the insurance compensation would have been based on the individual claims that each of us 31 farmers would experience, or whether we experienced it or didn't experience it, and we would have to report it. The insurance company would have to come and visit and verify it, and so on. Now, in this case, with yield index, the product would be something like saying, okay, what is the average yield that the 31 farmers have experienced? So if the average yield of all the insured farmers, or all the farmers in that area even, is below a certain threshold, then automatically all the insured farmers would be eligible to the same level of compensation in that particular area. On the other hand, if the average yield was higher than whatever the trigger threshold was linked to the yield, then no farmer would receive compensation. So you can see the underlying index here with yield index is based on the average yield in a particular area. Now that area can be at different levels. It could be all the way at the village level, or even within the village there could be clusters, or it could be at a subdivisional level, or maybe a district level, and so on. Each of those have their advantages and disadvantages. But so essentially, coming back to the official definition, yield index is a kind of index insurance product where all the farmers who have purchased the insurance product in the area, for example, let's say the area is a commune, they would be automatically compensated by a certain amount if the average yield, crop yield, in that particular area is below a certain threshold. So, for example, the average yield might be based on the historical yield, and in that case, the trigger threshold might be set at a certain percentage of the historical average. So, if we know that the average yield is, let's say, 1 ton per acre for a certain crop, then the average might be set at 900 kgs or 800 kgs. So, a certain percentage below the average. So that's essentially what yield index is. It's a kind of index insurance, but where the underlying index is based on the average yield experienced in the particular area. So now, if we go to the next slide, what are some of the pros and cons of yield index insurance? Um, well, with yield index insurance, you can see that the claims processing, so assessing whether a claim is valid or not and whether it should be paid or not, if so, how much, and so on. This becomes much easier for yield index compared to indemnity, because the insurance company doesn't need to visit each farmer who claims. In fact, there is no scope for farmers to report claims as such. It's purely based on the average yield in an area. So, strictly speaking, there is for index insurance products, there's no scope or flexibility for farmers to report claims, although there could be some variations on that. So, in terms of the advantages with yield index insurance, the claims processing might be much easier to do, because it basically needs an estimate of the average yield in a particular area, let's say a, a particular commune or a village, and so on. Um, as a result of the claims processing becoming much easier, and also the historical yield data might be easier to access rather than individual farmers' loss information. So, for these factors, the product might become much cheaper compared to indemnity insurance products. So, these products might be more affordable for small scale farmers, and even for other farmers. It could be much easier to for claims to be processed, to be verified. There is, coming back to that question on moral hazard, there is some scope of moral hazard here still, if one says that, okay, because of having insurance, all the farmers in the area did not, were not incentivized to take as many precautions or to maximize their efforts as much as they would have without insurance. But it's much less moral hazard compared to indemnity insurance, where with indemnity insurance, the individual farmers know that if they have a loss, they might be able to report a claim, and that claim might be paid. But here, because it's depending on the experience of a large number of farmers in a particular area, many of the farmers may not even know who else is insured. So, as a result, the scope for moral hazard and even adverse selection is much lower for yield index insurance. And all of these reasons make it easier to reinsure, for the insurance companies to transfer the risk to the reinsurance companies. Um, there is also, if the product works very well, very accurately, in that case, the basis risk that we talked about earlier, so this mismatch between farmers' experience and the insurance payouts, this might also be much less compared to some other categories of index products. But that is if the product is designed very accurately, and if the yield can be assessed at a very granular, at a very localized level, which is not always the case. So anyway, those are the advantages for yield index, but there are quite a few downsides still. We've seen that with yield index, it's generally difficult to scale up or to roll it out everywhere. And also now, if it needs to be rolled out for different crops, it's quite difficult to do so for various crops. Why? Because it's to do with the data issues. It's also to do with how well the yield assessments can be done. So, we see in most countries that for certain crops, maybe food crops like rice, maize in some countries, the yield data quality might be still better, or there might be more yield data available. But when it comes to other crops, maybe newer crops or horticulture crops, you may not have that many years of past data available. And also, the process for collecting yield data going forward may not be as robust as with some of the important food crops. So, as a result, these data challenges, both historical as well as operational, makes it difficult to replicate yield index in different areas and for different crops. It's possible to do so, but it is challenging. Um, and there can also be scope for potentially for conflict of interest or fraud. This might be the case, particularly if, for example, in some countries, I'll give the example of Bangladesh. There's some yield index products which are going on where the policyholder is actually an agribusiness. So it's in fact a rice seed producing company in Bangladesh. So there, the product is going on quite successfully over the last 3 or 4 years, but at a limited scale, only for the rice seed production of this particular company. But there is some scope for potentially for conflict of interest or even fraud, because the policyholder is also the source of the yield data. So the yield data that is being used to assess whether claims should be paid or not is actually coming from the policyholder. So in this case, in Bangladesh, fraud or conflict of interest has not been a problem per se, but there's a risk of it. So what the insurance company does in this case is they put in place an audit mechanism to actually audit the yield data to make sure that it's being collected accurately and correctly. Um, One of the other downsides we have seen also in other countries is yield index can sometimes be confused with indemnity insurance. So if you think back to the definition of crop indemnity insurance, that was also based on the experience of the crop um, in individual farmers' fields, or based on the losses which are reported. Now, yield index is also based on yield being assessed in the field and so on. So you can see that it becomes sometimes easy to confuse the two. Indeed, we have had cases in, for example, in Zambia, in Africa, where certain yield index products were sort of misunderstood as indemnity insurance products in the past. And so it took some explanation to explain that with yield index, it's not about farmers reporting losses or claims being verified, but it's about the yields being sampled. And not every farmer's field will be sampled. The sampling is done statistically. So maybe out of every 100 fields, one field might be sampled, for example. And these concepts of statistical sampling, as you can appreciate, will also be quite difficult to explain to the farmers sometimes, especially in seasons where they have experienced losses, and they would expect the assessment to be done at every field, even if it's possible. So these are some of the pros and cons of yield index, but certainly it is a very useful product category. Also, in the event of farming being done under irrigation, yield index might be very applicable, um, arguably more than some of the other categories of index insurance. And also, if the data quality is good, if there's at least 5 to 10 years worth of historical data on the same consistent basis, then yield index can be potentially implemented. In the next slide, we talk about another very important category of products, which is crop weather index insurance. Yeah. So with crop weather index insurance, it's a type of index insurance product where all the farmers who have purchased the insurance product in the area, for example, a commune, are automatically compensated if a certain amount of um, based on the actual weather conditions that have been experienced in the area. So again, if we think back to the example I was giving, see the 47 of us now. So if let's say there were all 47 of us attending here were farmers, and in that case the insurance product would be compensated to say to monitor the weather conditions which are being experienced. Now, it may not be possible for the insurance companies or other organizations to monitor weather conditions that each farmer experiences, because even the location of every farm may not be known, or the data may not be that localized. But still, maybe out of 47 of us, maybe there are 3 different points which can be monitored close to the groups of farmers. Now, that monitoring might happen using weather stations or using satellite data. And then specific events would be ensured, like specific bad weather events. So these could be events to do with rainfall, with temperature, with relative humidity, or even combinations of these weather parameters. So if the weather conditions observed shows that the specific bad weather event has taken place, then automatically all of us, all the insured farmers would receive a payout. So if, for example, it's observed that the rainfall is less than 90% of normal rainfall, of course, this is just an example. The trigger threshold can vary. The rainfall can be the rainfall over the whole season or over particular phases of the crop cycle, or there are many other possibilities. We look at some of those tomorrow when we look at the product design factors. So if those weather conditions have basically been less than the trigger level, or more than the trigger level, depending on what the parameters are, then automatically there would be a payout. And on the other hand, if the weather parameters have not been breached, then no one would receive a payout. So you can see both with weather index as well as yield index, it is possible for some farmers to have experienced losses. But then as a group, the weather conditions were okay, or the yield conditions were quite close to normal. So there was no payout. That is possible. And that is what we refer to as basis risk when we talk about the basis risk of index insurance. Now, the weather conditions, as I mentioned, there are many options of covering, of monitoring weather conditions. So it could be based on ground weather stations or rainfall gauges. It could be based on flood gauges if it's related to flooding, or it could be based on satellite data as well. Some years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the only option in most countries in Africa, in Asia, was using weather stations. But in the last 10 years, especially the last 5, 6 years, there have been a lot of developments. And now, for example, in Africa, most of the products are based on satellite technology. So that's monitoring of satellite parameters like rainfall, soil moisture, evapotranspiration, inundation level, and so on. Also in Asia, a lot of the products are being done using satellite technology. I'm aware that in Vietnam as well, satellite tech is being used. I think we'll talk a little bit about that in the session that Tin will be presenting on the rice product and afterwards as well. Um, Also in other countries in the region, satellite tech is being used in Cambodia as well. Satellite technology is being tried out by the Ministry of Finance in a Ministry of Finance scheme for weather index crop insurance. Okay, so that's weather index insurance, where basically the underlying index is based on the relevant weather parameters, which can be relevant to the farmers who are being insured. So with weather index, as you can see, it's only focusing on the very specific weather-related risks. It is not, directly covering any other risks. It could potentially indirectly cover other risks like pest and disease and so on, but to the extent that the specific weather parameters being insured are relevant for pest and disease, for example. But it's only covering the weather risks directly. Then in the next slide, we just some more information on the weather index insurance. That, as I mentioned, it can be based on different either weather stations or satellite data. The parameters are basically all the weather parameters which can be measured and for which historical data is available. So in some cases, we see that generally speaking, rainfall has the most amount of historical data available globally even. There are multiple sources of satellite data which estimate rainfall. Some of the other parameters are also available from different sources, be it satellite or be it weather stations as well. So, for example, parameters like wind speed can also be tracked using satellite data, which could also be quite relevant for um, risk events like cyclones, for example, or tropical storms and so on. Now, these underlying bases for measuring the weather parameters are used for collecting the weather data. And then once the data is available, then automatically there should be a calculation to check whether the payout is triggered or not. And then this data is also used for, of course, for the monitoring of the product itself as to whether payouts are due or not. Also, it can be used for pricing the product at the start and then of revising the pricing on an ongoing basis and for making adjustments to the product design as well. So the data is used to check whether payouts are due or not. And if payouts are due, then they can be made automatically. Again, as you can see in this process, there is no need and indeed no scope for farmers to actually report losses or have to prove that there's a valid claim. Also, there is no scope for insurance companies to send a representative to the field to check whether a loss is valid or not. Yeah, so the entire system is automated essentially based on the weather data that's being monitored on an ongoing basis. Now, with this kind of product, it has its pros and cons again, as outlined in the next slide. Um, so on the advantages, one big advantage is because the claims processing is does not require farmers to report losses or verify, or for local authorities to verify losses and authorize losses and so on. It is essentially the claims processing is much easier. Also, the insurance company or its representatives don't have to go to different fields and check whether there was a problem with whether a claim is due or not. So, because of these reasons, as you can see, the claims processing is much easier and it's generally much quicker as well. So, with Weather Index, this is a key advantage of Weather Index, that it can lead to very quick payouts. So, as we were giving the example in the earlier session, with Weather Index is one category of products where you can have payouts happening even a few days after planting potentially. If immediately after planting the insured event takes place, then one would know if a payout is due or not. So the speed of the payout is most probably the highest for Weather Index compared to other types of compared to Yield Index and compared to Indemnity as well, definitely. Um, and because the claims processing is much easier, it also becomes more affordable because the expenses that insurance companies will otherwise incur for claims processing is not there anymore. So claims processing becomes much easier, and the expenses are lower. So as a result, the insurance premium can also become lower, and the products can be more affordable. Again, similarly to Yield Index, it's the scope for moral hazard or adverse selection is even lower. It's arguably the lowest here compared to the other categories of products. And all of these reasons, also combined with availability of a lot of data on the weather conditions, Uh, Again, usually much more data compared to the other product categories. So all of this makes it much easier to insure and reinsure. So weather index is still the most common form of agriculture insurance, especially when it comes to crops. Crop weather index is still the most common form of agriculture insurance for small scale farmers specifically, and specifically for countries in Asia and also in Africa. It's still quite common compared to the other categories. Um, it's Of course there are quite a few downsides. One downside is there is a probability of basis risk. So there can be a situation where farmers experience a loss for non-weather conditions or even for weather conditions, but there is no compensation, or the compensation is not sufficient. We can go into the details of that a little bit later if you want, or I think in the product design um, module we'll cover tomorrow, we'll also talk about this in more detail. But basis risk is a challenge with weather index, as it is also a challenge with yield index and other types of index insurance products. These products can be quite difficult to explain. Potentially, it might be quite tricky to explain these products because, again, the aspects that it's only covering specific weather conditions. These conditions, which are being covered, are also very can be quite technical in nature, and it might be quite difficult to explain what exactly the product covers, what exactly the trigger level is, how it was established, and so on. Also, if for example, if the products are based on satellite data, as you can imagine, it would be quite difficult to explain the satellite technology to a lot of small scale farmers. Um, and also the fact that it's essentially protecting, it's providing an element of protection to the farmers by proxy. It's not directly protecting the farmers from their agricultural loss, but it's only ensuring the weather conditions which they are expected to have experienced. So it's really ensuring by proxy rather than directly. So overall, yeah, and as a result, it offers relatively limited protection from all the risks that farmers are experiencing. So those are the downsides or the challenges with crop weather index insurance. Now, in the next slide, we talk of another important category of products, which is livestock index. Now, as far as we know, this category has not been tried out in Vietnam so far, but there are quite a few examples of this being done in other countries. This category of product is not always relevant in a country. It really depends on the climatology and the vegetation conditions, and yeah, and also the livestock rearing practices. But essentially, with livestock index, it is a type of insurance product where the farmers are compensated based on an index again, and the index is it should be strongly correlated. It should be strongly linked to livestock losses. So an example of this is using vegetation cover on the ground. So there are some satellite-based vegetation index products also in East Africa and countries like Kenya and Ethiopia, for example, where essentially the coverage on the ground, the vegetation index cover on the ground, is used as a proxy for the health of the livestock. So in this case, the livestock is grazing openly, and so the vegetation on the ground is seen as a indication of whether the livestock has enough vegetation for its grazing purposes or not. Um, so this is one category of products which is going on in some countries, but as I say, it's not always applicable because it really depends on the grazing practices and also the vegetation conditions in different countries. But in the next slides, we have the pros and cons of this category of product. So again, similar to before, the claims processing becomes much easier to do. So this kind of product is quite affordable as well as a result, relatively speaking, or it can be cheaper in cost because the claims processing is easier. So the claims expenses are much lower compared to indemnity insurance. Um, the risk of moral hazard and adverse selection is again lower, and all of this makes it easier to reinsure as well. Also combined with the increased availability of data as well. On the downside, it's more difficult to explain. Basis risk is there. Some additional factors is, it really requires a detailed knowledge of the livestock rearing practices, and also quite detailed livestock mortality or sickness data. So to give you an example, some of the livestock index products which have happened, there's been a lot of work that's happened in Kenya over the last many years, and there's been a lot of research that's gone into it with the um, International Livestock Research Institute, or ILRI, has carried out a lot of research to understand the herding practices in Kenya, which areas, how the livestock herds move and migrate. They've collected more mortality data as well to understand, which years caused livestock mortality because of low pastures or lack of water availability, and so on. So this, just the research itself has gone on for in excess of 3 or 4 years before they could actually develop the product. So it's quite research intensive to have an accurate livestock index product. But it depends. It doesn't always have to be that case in the same way. It depends on the amount of data availability. So if there's a lot of data available at the outset, it's something which could be fast tracked potentially. But it's still quite research intensive. Um, Another category of products is aquaculture index insurance. And again, with aquaculture index insurance, it's again, there are very few examples of this category of products in terms of index insurance. Of course, there are examples of aquaculture indemnity, including in Vietnam. But with aquaculture index, there are some examples, but not many. So this category of products, basically, it's a type of insurance product where the compensation is based on an index, which is strongly correlated with aquaculture losses. So an example of this was actually trialed in China a few years ago, where the index was based on temperature. So if the temperature was very high in terms of in related to the aquaculture farms, then that would correlate with the fish stock dying, basically. So with the aquaculture index product, the underlying parameter for the index in that case was high temperature. And in the next slide, we look at the pros and cons of aquaculture insurance. So again, quite similar to before in terms of the advantages. It's essentially the same as with livestock insurance. Um, and also the downsides are quite similar, except again, you need a lot of detailed, granular information on aquaculture mortality data, which is quite difficult to obtain. Also to understand which parameters exactly are actually relevant for aquaculture production. So it could be to do with temperature, or it could be to do with other parameters as well. It could even be to do with pollution levels in some cases, although again, those parameters are quite difficult to track as well. So at this stage, I just want to touch upon a few other points on aquaculture, because there was that question asked before the break on some international experiences on aquaculture. So generally, yeah, there has been some experiences with aquaculture insurance in different countries. So for example, the typical risks which have been insured are risks like floods, inundation, tidal waves, other risks like storm damage, also damage to the actual assets of the infrastructure related in aquaculture farming. Other specific risks insured were on disease, parasitic infestations, uh, the predatory, so the predation. So basically, if there was a, if the fish stock died because of predator, that's also been done in some cases on a indemnity basis. And some of the weather parameters, as I was mentioning, have also been covered, like temperature fluctuations, deoxygenation, increased salinity in the water, changes in the normal chemical constituents of the water as well, and so on. Now, these products, some of these products have been tried out in the USA and countries in Europe like France, Italy, Norway, Spain, UK, in South America, in Chile, for example, and also in Asia. Aquaculture insurance has been trialed. Of course, in China, there's been quite a bit of experience in this, and also in India, there's been quite a bit of experience from the 1990s, in Bangladesh as well, and in Japan as well. Now, with aquaculture insurance, again, just the last point, of course, there are many challenges. I think one of the key challenges is that the management standards, especially related to stock control, needs to be very good. There needs to be very proactive risk management approach that the farmers are carrying out. And indeed, this might even be a prerequisite for the insurance companies in the first place to have this risk management in place. Because without that, there can be very large claims, especially related to diseases and so on, which, from what we understand, that's also been some of the challenges experienced in Vietnam in the past related to aquaculture insurance. There's also, in general, another big challenge is that the water is quite a inconsistent environment, so it makes it quite difficult to actually account for the fish stock, to treat for diseases and so on. So it's quite challenging environment. It's also quite sensitive to temperature fluctuations and the chemical composition of water. So maybe I'll stop there on the aquaculture side. And then the last product category we wanted to talk about before we move into the international experiences is the hybrid index in the next slide. So the hybrid index is basically, it's a broad term which can be used to say, to imply that you can combine the different indices we talked about before. So it's possible to combine more than one index in the same product. Or indeed, it's also possible sometimes to combine index and indemnity cover. So there are examples of these practices. For example, quite a well-known example of combining weather index and yield index was done in India some years ago in what was known as the Modified National Agriculture Insurance Scheme. That's been changed subsequently. But at that time, the combination was basically having a weather index cover for the early part of the season, and then having an yield index cover for the end of the season. Or so essentially, the weather index would enable the product to trigger payouts quickly, but then the final yield assessment, the final claim compensation would be based on the average yield in a particular area. Now, there are other examples. In Nigeria, there's been a insurance product launched last year together with the government, with the Ministry of Finance involvement, where it's a combination of weather index and indemnity insurance. So the weather perils are covered using a weather index approach, and specific non-weather risks such as fire and also pest and disease are covered using indemnity. Now, obviously, there's quite a few advantages with this kind of approach. So, to the extent that the index insurance products, the advantages of the index insurance products are still there, that it can make claims processing easier, it can potentially be affordable, although there's a limitation there as well. Uh, and the moral hazard and adverse selection is less of a problem. It can also potentially reduce basis risk. So this challenge of the index insurance products only being relevant for the specific index, this can be reduced to the extent that we are using multiple indices or we are combining index with indemnity. And so overall, it can offer more comprehensive coverage or protection for the farmers. But there are downsides. There's actually still a probability of basis risk. Why? Because especially if there are limitations on the price, which is usually the case in terms of the insurance premium, in that case, the specific triggers or the specific parameters which we are applying for this product might be quite strict. So, in other words, so if you using the example from before, if on a standalone basis, if the let's say if the trigger for the yield index product was 90% of the average yield, if you're combining yield index with weather index, the price is more or less the same as the first option. In that case, the trigger for yield index might have to be 70% now. So you might end up having very strict triggers because you're trying to squeeze in multiple indices. So that can sometimes lead to a high basis risk as well, because essentially, if the triggers have not been breached, if the triggers have not, if the conditions are not below the trigger levels or above the trigger levels, depending on what the risk is. In that case, there is no payout. So if your triggers are too strict, that can lead to no payout, although the conditions might be still quite bad. So basis risk problem might still be there with hybrid products as well. It can become more difficult to explain. It's more complicated and technical, and you're also protecting the losses by proxy still to the extent that you're focusing only on index insurance. There's another disadvantage, it's not mentioned there, that it can also, typically these hybrid products become much more expensive, as you would imagine, because now you're combining different indices together, so they can become more expensive as well. So that was a very quick sort of run through the different product categories. I know you might be having quite a few questions, but feel free to write them in the chat or make a note of them. And I'm sure we'll have time to have a good Q&A session after the next section. At the end of the next two sections. If it's okay, we can move into the next session, which is on the international case studies. In the next slide, there is a quick summary of some of the different product categories that have taken place in different countries in Asia. So as you can see, there's been a lot of experience in Asia and in other countries in Southeast Asia as well with different types of agriculture insurance. So, of course, there are many more experiences which we have not been able to document everything, but it's just a snapshot of experiences we are aware of where we've been involved in some way. You can see you have the different countries, and then you also have the product categories which have been tried out in the different countries. So as you can see, a lot of the products have been index insurance products. Probably weather index has still been the most common product in the context of small scale farmers, but there has been quite a bit of variation as well. So yield index has also been tried out in some countries. In Bangladesh, it's been tried out mostly with private sector clients, and actually without any kind of premium subsidy. This is an interesting feature of Bangladesh compared to the other countries. Most of the other countries have premium subsidies from the government, but in Bangladesh, there's not been any so far. But still, it's been going on for about six years now, with purely a private sector approach, and with the premiums being paid for by the farmers or by the agriculture value chain stakeholders as well. So in terms of coming back to the product categories, there's been other types of products which have been tried out, like indemnity insurance, um, uh, to do with livestock, also to do with crop as well. So crop indemnity has been tried out in the Philippines, also in the context of small scale farmers. And crop indemnity has also been tried out in Sri Lanka, as I was mentioning in the morning, which has been very specific. So it's been focused on rice and specifically to do with flood, drought, and elephant trampling. Um, and so on. So there's different categories of products which have been tried out. In terms of crops, you can see a very common product that's been tried out, that's been the focus in many countries is rice, obviously because it's the staple food in most countries in Asia. But also there's been some variation in Bangladesh. There's been quite a lot of coverage related to vegetables. Um, there's also been some experience with livestock in Bangladesh. In India as well, there's been experience with livestock as well, and so on. And when you look at the approach, it is interesting. Again, most of the approaches are actually government led or with close cooperation of a public private partnership, with the exception of Bangladesh, really, where it's been more private sector led. In terms of successes, so obviously all of these countries have had lots of challenges in implementing these schemes. And I would say that in most cases, the schemes have still not scaled up very thoroughly. In India, the scheme had scaled up quite a lot. Millions of farmers were being insured and so on. But again, in recent years, in the last 1 or 2 years, there are quite large changes going on. So currently, it's not quite clear how the scheme will go, how it will continue. But in most other cases, the schemes are still very new. They're still more at a kind of a pilot stage, or at a stage where a sufficient number, quite a large number of farmers are being insured, as in maybe in excess of 10,000 farmers being insured every year. But it's still very small compared to the number of farmers in these countries. Another interesting feature has been the claims ratio. So that's a term we'll come across quite a bit over the remaining sessions. The claims ratio is basically the ratio of claims to premium, and it's a very quick indication of whether the schemes might be profitable for the insurance companies or not. It doesn't give the full picture, but it gives a quick indication of whether the schemes has the potential of becoming profitable for the insurance companies or not, and as a result, whether they would be viable or not in the long run for the insurance sector. So claims ratios have generally been quite manageable when it comes to index insurance products. But of course, if you look at indemnity insurance products, claims ratios are very high. So maybe using the example of India, where there's been a lot of experience over the years, claims ratios for example, for the index products, both weather index and yield index, has been in the region of about 60, 70%, sometimes even less. Which means that the products have been relatively good value for money for the clients, at the same time quite profitable for the insurance companies. But if you look at indemnity products, even in India, claims ratios might be in excess of 300%. So in other words, for every $1 paid in premium, $3 were paid out in claims in the long run. So that makes it very difficult for those to be viable from an insurance business perspective. So there's been quite a few successes of each of these in each of these different countries, and I think we'll I won't go through all of it right now, but of course you will have the material afterwards, and we will talk about some of the successes as in the remainder of this session. So in the next slide, we have just an overall information on the general framework of agriculture insurance schemes. And again, this is quite relevant to understand what could be some of the potential roles of government. So as you can see, it's very important for government to create an enabling environment. So from the Ministry of Finance, this could be to do with, this could be related to premium subsidies or premium financing. It could be to do with general supervision of the schemes. There are specific roles, of course, in the context of Vietnam that we'll be covering also in detail tomorrow. But generally speaking, these are some of the different roles. Ministry of Agriculture, their roles would be relating to provision of agricultural data. They might play a role in the loss assessment or in also in terms of the awareness or sensitization of farmers. The insurance regulatory authority, they also have a very key role to play. Sorry, it says Uganda there. It's a mistake. The insurance regulatory authority would have a very key role to play in terms of the regulations of the different insurance products. And the meteorological department would also have a role to play in terms of provision of weather data, for example. So there's a role that many of the government stakeholders have in order to create an enabling environment. And then the risk transfer element comes in. So this is where the different insurance companies, some of whom are attending this session, are extremely crucial. The reinsurance companies are extremely crucial as well. So they would be carrying the risk essentially. And then the different participants of the agriculture value chain are extremely relevant. Of course, the farmers who are the ultimate beneficiary, who should be the ultimate beneficiary of these types of products, as well as the other stakeholders they're working with. So some of these could be the legal representatives of the farmers as well, such as the farmer organizations, the agribusinesses, the financial institutions, and so on. So, of course, they all have interrelations with each other, and it's possible for the farmers to insure themselves or for the farmer organization to insure itself. It's also possible for the farmers to be insured through some of these other entities. And it is also possible for these entities to insure themselves, so more from a corporate level or at the company level or a portfolio level. It's also possible for these institutions to insure themselves. So those are some of the general stakeholders. Now, in that context, what are some of the examples of the role that government has actually played in other countries? So if you go to the next slide, one important role is, of course, on premium subsidies, as I think was also mentioned during the discussion we were having earlier. Now, with premium subsidies, so with premium subsidies are of course extremely important, but and they can really help with enabling the farmers to actually access the products in the first place, making the products affordable to the farmers, leading to a scale up of agriculture insurance. But then again, the implementation of the subsidies should be done very effectively. So there are some countries where premium subsidies were in place, and yet agriculture insurance didn't really take off. This is actually, there was an example in Uganda a few years ago where premium subsidies was available, but agriculture insurance had not really taken off until they made many other operational changes in the way that agriculture insurance was being implemented. So on its own, premium subsidies would not be effective, but it can be, of course, a very important tool in combination with other interventions. So the premium subsidies, there's been premium subsidies in many different countries. Approximately speaking, it's varied between 20-30% to 80% or even 100%. So in Africa, premium subsidies are there in various countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Senegal, Uganda. In all these countries, there are national schemes. and these schemes have premium subsidies. In Asia, of course, premium subsidies are also there in many countries, including Vietnam, of course. Um, there's also premium subsidies in Europe at different levels, as some examples are given over there. And looking at some of the common themes with premium subsidies in different countries, we see that usually premium subsidies don't apply across all crops per se. I think just addressing one of the questions raised earlier about how are premium subsidies applied. So I think these points would help to answer that. Premium subsidies don't always apply for all the crops, really. So generally, they don't necessarily apply for very commercial crops, for example, or crops which would be mostly be done by large commercial farmers or even medium to emerging farmers. They may not apply. It could apply, but they usually apply for very specific crops. These are usually food crops, but of course some cash crops are also in scope sometimes, and they are also generally means tested. So like in Vietnam, as well as the question from the comment from the regulator was earlier, that yeah, usually in other countries as well, the premium subsidies are means tested, or they're focusing more on the low income farmers. um, Again, to give the quick example of Uganda, the premium subsidies are there for smallholder farmers, the low income farmers, and it's also there for commercial farmers, but it varies. So the premium subsidy is higher for the low income farmers, and the premium subsidy is much lower for commercial farmers, or for certain farmers, it doesn't even apply. For certain commercial farmers, it wouldn't even apply. So subsidies might also vary between crops and livestock. So in some countries, the subsidy levels are different between crops and livestock. Then in implementing the subsidies in some countries like India, Croatia, Slovenia, the subsidy budget is actually shared between the central and the regional government. That's just to do with how it is administered. The premium subsidies might also be implemented through premium pre-financing, um, or through tax waivers, or a reduction in the premium tax. So the point here is that apart from direct premium subsidies, there is scope for indirect subsidies for example, by the government pre-financing the agriculture insurance premiums. So in other words, paying the premium on behalf of the farmers. And there is also scope for not really a direct subsidy, but for the tax that applies on the premium to be either waived or reduced. So again, a good example of this is in Rwanda, where there was a reinsurance tax for about 15% that would apply on the agriculture insurance premium, that was basically being passed on to the farmers. So at some point, there was a change in the regulations which removed that tax from agriculture insurance products, which was essentially similar to having a 15% subsidy on the premium. But it wasn't really a subsidy per se, it was a waiver of the tax, specifically for agriculture insurance. Then, of course, for the subsidies to be effective, the farmer level awareness is very important. So in some countries, we've seen that if farmers are not really aware of the existence of the subsidy, or how it works and its benefits, or whether they're eligible for it or not, in that case, they won't be accessing the premium subsidy, and they wouldn't be accessing the insurance products as much as if they were aware of the fact that the subsidy existed and they were eligible for it and how to access it. So it's important for farmer awareness to be there on the premium subsidies. Also important to differentiate insurance premium subsidy from other types of government interventions, such as loan waivers due to disasters or disaster relief. So it should not be confused with these other types of interventions. Because in that case, apart from other challenges, it can also create, uh, you know, um, wrong expectations among farmers if they confuse the premium subsidy with a loan waiver, for example, or even disaster relief from government. Um, so again, in some cases, we see that subsidies are limited to specific insurance companies. Um, and that has been done for good reasons in some countries where the subsidies are only given to certain insurance companies who are, who have the capacity for underwriting agriculture insurance in the first place and so on. However, some challenges we see and we've seen in some countries is it can also lead to kind of a monopoly in a way. So only those companies which have the premium subsidy are able to offer a much cheaper product in the market. And as a result, fewer insurers are involved. And as a result of this, there is lack of innovation of products, or there's not enough competition in the market among insurance companies. So that can actually be one of the downsides of having a premium subsidy that is only limited to specific insurance companies. Moving to the next slide on some of the other roles that government can play. So this is specifically related to the roles on risk transfer, um, and also related to institutional setup and other roles. So on the risk transfer, so as we were talking about the importance of the reinsurance company as a key stakeholder, so in many cases with agriculture insurance in particular, as well as a few other categories of products, government can actually also play a key role as a reinsurer. So in this case, the insurance companies can actually transfer the risk of large losses to government. I can give you a quick example of this before we move into more specific examples. There is a particular state in India, state of Maharashtra, where they have a system. It's called the Bead Model, where basically the government sort of guarantees the insurance companies that the losses won't exceed 110% of the premium collected. So if the losses exceeded 110% of the premium collected, then government would be liable for the excess loss. But on the other hand, if the losses were less than um, a certain percentage of the premium. So it can vary. It could be 80%, it could be 70%, like that. If it is less than a certain amount of the premium collected, then the insurance company will have to actually pay some of the premium back to government. So there is a premium subsidy in place, and then government is also playing the role of a reinsurer. And in the years which are very profitable for the insurance companies, they have to return some of the subsidy to government. But then in the bad years, government will cover the excess loss. So it's a little bit of a controversial model also in India. I mean, some states like it, some states don't, some insurance companies don't like it, and so on. But anyway, that's just a quick example. But coming to more specific examples, in Mexico, Spain, and Turkey, uh, the government institutions have been providing agriculture reinsurance support. In quite a few other countries as well, from Canada to also in Japan, Mongolia, USA, government has been providing reinsurance as well, for specifically for agriculture insurance. And then also in Portugal, government provides stop loss reinsurance protection um, for defined agricultural risk zones. So essentially, those risk zones which are seen to be higher risk, government is trying to encourage insurers to offer products there by having a stop loss reinsurance arrangement. Stop loss basically means that if the losses have become very bad, then the government will reinsure losses above a certain percentage. So it could be, let's say, 200% of the premium. So if the losses are twice as much as the premium, then government would cover the excess losses above 200%, just as an example. So there are quite a few examples where government has been playing the role of a reinsurer. We'll look at a detail of this in the next slide. But apart from being the reinsurer, government can also set up specialist institutions for co-insurance. So for different insurance companies to come together in a co-insurance arrangement for risk sharing and for insuring the agricultural risks as a pool, essentially. Yeah, so this has happened in countries like Mongolia, where there's a public-private co-insurance pool established in 2006, so about 15 years ago now, for offering livestock index mortality insurance through the livestock insurance indemnity pool. This has also happened in Philippines with a public-private co-insurance pool established as far back as 1978 for livestock insurance. And it has quite a few, about 14 participating co-insurers. In Spain as well, there's a insurance pool about 40 years old now, over 40 years old, the Agroseguro, which might be the world's largest public-private co-insurance pool. And in Turkey as well, there's been quite a successful co-insurance pool where basically different insurance companies have come together, each with a certain percentage. So about 16 companies have come together with the same percentage. So it's just about six percentage of the risk. So basically, whatever premiums are collected are shared in that same percentage, and whatever claims are paid out are also paid in the same percentage. The pool has premium subsidies. In the case of Turkey, the specific pool is called Tarsim, and the pool also has premium subsidies. There's also subsidies for administration and operational expenses. And then also there's subsidies on the claims handling expenses. So it's quite heavily subsidized. There's also a subsidy on the tax exemption, as I was mentioning earlier, on the premium sales tax is exempted. And there's also reinsurance support. So there's quite a lot of heavy government involvement in Turkey, and it's seen as quite a successful model in that region. And then now moving away from the role on premium subsidies and on reinsurance, and then on the setting up of specialist institutions or co-insurance pools, government also has a very crucial role to play with different operational aspects such as extension services, loss assessments, awareness raising of farmers, and administrative roles as well. And again, there's quite a few examples where government has been doing this in India, Sri Lanka, Thailand, also in Vietnam, there's experiences on this, and also in Zambia. Okay, then moving on to the next slide, we go into some more details on the scheme in Mexico related to reinsurance. So in the next slide, we're talking about the Mexican Agricultural Fund for Natural Disasters, or CADENA. Just the one before. Thanks. So this was launched nearly 20 years ago in 2003 by the Ministry of Agriculture. And essentially in this system, state governments purchase insurance in order to protect their budgetary allocation from specific risks. So the risks are mostly related to natural disasters on an indexed basis. And the focus here is on the more vulnerable low-income farmers. The premiums are actually financed by both the state and the central government. And there's a minimum level of compensation that's provided to, a basic level of compensation that is provided to the vulnerable small-scale farmers. Of course, then CADENA is part of a larger national program called FONDEN, or the Fund for Natural Disasters. And this fund is also transferred to the international markets through reinsurance and catastrophe bonds and so on. Right. So some of the key takeaways from this experience has been that Ministry of Agriculture played a very key role in setting up the scheme and in targeting it at the particularly vulnerable farmers. Ministry of Finance is also playing a very key role in subsidizing the premiums. And this is a good example actually of insurance being used um, to protect the budgetary allocation for disaster relief. So in the case of natural disasters, the insurance product can actually be leveraged on, can be used for making payouts for basically for providing disaster relief to the vulnerable farmers. So as was mentioned earlier, that sometimes insurance and disaster relief can almost be sort of contradicting each other, or yeah, there could be a conflict between each other in a way. In other words, farmers might be waiting for disaster relief rather than purchasing insurance. But again, the insurance mechanism itself can also be used potentially as a way of funding disaster relief. Similar initiatives have also going on currently in Africa, in countries like Malawi, Uganda, Kenya, where the World Bank is trying to use some of these index insurance products as a way of triggering additional social cash transfers. So there are social cash transfers in place, funded by the government of these countries as well as other donors. And when natural disasters take place, they're trying to see if there are ways of having a drought index approach to scaling up social cash transfer. But that's again a different topic. And then moving on to the next slide, okay. So in terms of this example, I wanted to talk about from Sri Lanka, um, which is basically it's a good one in terms of the government's role, in particular the Ministry of Agriculture's role with an insurance product that's being rolled out in many parts of the country. So this is being implemented by a company called Agriculture and Agrarian Insurance Board, or AAIB. It's a part public sector company. And essentially, they have a few different products there, including commercial insurance that's being rolled out with banks on a credit linked basis. So the insurance is bundled with agricultural loans. Um, they also have a voluntary product that farmers can subscribe to, which is a crop insurance product. And it's also covering commercial crops, such as coffee and tea, for example, in Sri Lanka. But in addition, the biggest product they have is actually a product that's linked to a government fertilizer subsidy program. So here in Sri Lanka, basically, the farmers are entitled to fertilizer subsidies, and the insurance product is basically bundled with um, the fertilizer subsidy that the farmers receive. So the insurance premium rate is around 4 to 5%, or 3 to 5% even. It varies depending on the kind of irrigation the farmer practices, as I was mentioning earlier. And essentially, the insurance is covering the fertilizer subsidy that the farmers are receiving. So essentially, it's covering a part of it's covering a big proportion of the production cost that the farmers have. Then in the next slide, we look at some of the specific roles that the government is playing here in Sri Lanka. So in the next slide, we can see. So the Ministry of Agriculture, a key role they have played is on the legislative or regulatory side, in that they have made it mandatory or compulsory for the agriculture insurance to be bundled with all farmers who are receiving the input subsidies. So approximately 1 million farmers receive it, a little bit less than 1 million farmers every year, and all of them should have the insurance coverage as well. It doesn't always happen in that way, but that's the plan, or that's the objective. So they have made it mandatory officially to all the farmers. Um, and they also provide data for the design and pricing of the products. So, for example, they provide the agriculture yield data, production data, information on the damages experienced, and so on. They also provide guidelines on the product design and pricing. So they actually provide guidelines on what they would like to see the product structure to be. And even the pricing, they provide the rates that can be charged. So it's more of a tariff based or like rates which are given by the government. Um, but that is not always the best approach though, but that's what they do in this case. They also facilitate the sensitization or the training of the product, the administration and claims processing of as well. So all of these tasks are done by field operatives. So the Ministry of Agriculture extension staff play a role in raising awareness, in collecting premiums, in enrolling the farmers. Also, when it comes to claims, because this is primarily an indemnity-based product, mostly, although there's some weather index products being trialed as well, but it's mostly a indemnity based product. So the field operatives or the field extension staff also play a key role in actually assessing the losses. So they have a community like a claims assessment um, forum in each village, which actually goes to assess whether a claim is valid or not. Um, the insurance company reports directly to the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Agriculture in this case also regulates this specific insurance product. Now, with the Ministry of Finance, of course, it is playing a key role in the subsidy of the premium, and also it is stipulating the extent to which the premium can be pre-financed by the government, also the farmer's contribution and the proportion of the subsidy for different crops. So it's in charge of basically deciding how the subsidy is implemented. Yeah. And then finally, another example on the government role is related to Zambia, where I'm based, on the role that the government plays linked to, in relation to weather index insurance linked to the farmer input support program. So in the next slide, we have information on this. Um, yeah. So in Zambia, there's again, it's a little bit similar to the example in Sri Lanka, but this is an input subsidy program that's been going on for many years. And a few years ago, insurance product was piloted for a couple of years, and then it was scaled up since 2017 now. So it's been going on for about 4 years now. And in this case, the Ministry of Agriculture is basically acting as a distribution channel. So for actually delivering the product directly to the farmers. And also in linking the product to farm input subsidies. So the way the product works, just to give some examples of the value insured, it's approximately 170 US dollars per farmer. The premium comes to only about 10 US dollars per farmer. Um, and it's being in this scheme, basically the farmers are able to access inputs both electronically and using e-voucher. They are able to access inputs which are subsidized from registered agro dealers. So there's about 1,200 such agro dealers around the country. So when they access the inputs, they also have to contribute a certain amount of money in order to access the inputs. It's about $40. So if they contribute $40, government would then contribute $170. So they would have $210 on their input package. So from that $210 on the input package, $10 goes towards insurance. So they have $200 left for buying farming inputs. So essentially, the government is playing a very key role here in terms of pre-financing the premium. So it's not really a subsidy because the premium is being adjusted from the total input cost or the total input subsidy that the farmer received in the first place. So it is a form of subsidy because it's coming from the input subsidies, but it's not a pure premium subsidy. It's integrated within the farming input subsidy. And some of the key takeaways for this has been that index insurance can be integrated on a mandatory basis with a government's input subsidy program. But of course, there are many challenges in doing that. So a lot of sensitization is required, a lot of awareness raising, premium pre-financing needs to be done on a very efficient basis. With this scheme, which is also sometimes a challenge with other schemes where government subsidies are involved, one of the challenges has been that there have been very severe delays in the premium subsidies being paid. Sometimes in some countries, the delays can be even 1 or 2 years in some cases. So as a result, then as you can imagine, that leads to insurance companies not being able to pay claims and so on, or the insurance cover even not being valid in some cases because the full insurance premium was not paid. So those are some of the challenges also associated with implementing premium subsidies or even premium pre-financing. Okay, then moving on to the next slide, we talk about some of the some of the important product types. So as we've already been introduced to the different product categories previously, just to give some examples of where these products are actually going on, or and what some of the experiences have been. So yield index insurance has been scaled up in some countries, such as in India since 2010. So for the last 10, 11 years now. Um, and there have been some challenges, such as the accuracy of the data, the cost of doing crop cut experiments, CCEs, as a way of assessing the yield. So in India, for example, about in excess of 1 million CCEs used to be carried out across the country every year. So as you can imagine, there's quite a huge cost attached to carrying out 1 million CCEs. But even then, there were challenges with the accuracy of the data and issues of the data not being localized enough for it to be accurate for the individual farmers being insured. There's also a challenge around high claims ratios. So sometimes the claims have been much higher than the premiums, which has made it difficult for some participating insurers or even reinsurers to continue. Yield index has also been tried out in many other countries, including Kenya, with subsidies in place, and also quite a few other countries. Some examples are given here. And the typical challenges across most of these countries has been that cost of doing crop cut experiments. It takes time for the data to be available. And because it takes time for the data to be available, typically the data is only available at the end of the season when the yield can be harvested. And even after that, it might take sometimes a few months for the data to be validated, cleaned, and officially available. So this can lead to delays in the claim settlement potentially. Yeah. Um, and also low farmer awareness has also been a challenge. For example, this issue of sometimes yield index being confused with indemnity insurance might be to do with challenges on the farmer level awareness. Also, low capacity for insurance companies to sell this product and in a mass way to different parts of the country, and relatively high premium rates as well. These have been some of the challenges. With weather index, this has been implemented quite extensively across many different countries. The different examples were given from Asia, and it's also been implemented quite extensively in Africa as well. Um, and and then also the indemnity insurance, both crop and livestock. So there are some examples of indemnity based products being done for small scale farmers even, but not many. There's some examples from Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, as I was mentioning earlier. But this is not very common to see for small scale farmers. And this is to do with the operational challenges involved in visiting individual farms, and also issues of the available data, issues of assessing the risk correctly, and so on. Generally, they're very difficult to reinsure as well, if it is a pure indemnity product for small scale farmers only. Um, then moving on to the next slide, we have a few other lessons and few other examples relating to livestock. Hmm. So, with livestock insurance as well as some other categories of products, um, the vegetation index products that I was mentioning earlier, the livestock index insurance products, these have been launched in Kenya. It's part of a national livestock insurance scheme. And in fact, this product has had 100% premium subsidy, because it's really focusing on very low income farmers, and also farmers in quite drought prone areas. So the premium has been fully subsidized. There are other examples of this kind of product happening in Ethiopia, in Zambia. There are similar challenges of high premium rates. Um, the payouts have sometimes taken a while to occur. The monitoring of the payouts has happened very quickly, but then actually the payouts actually going to the farmers has taken longer, because of the challenges related to the infrastructure being used for making the payouts. Um, so that's been one of the challenges with this type of product. Also, the relatively high claims ratios has been a challenge. Low awareness among farmers and also among insurers, challenges with data management, and also high dependency on premium subsidy has also been a challenge. And then you have indemnity based livestock insurance products as well, which have been implemented in some countries, such as in Bangladesh. Again, a challenge there has been the historical data availability, veterinary practices. So, not all farmers have had good access to veterinary practices. And the cost of monitoring the insured animals has also been a challenge. Potentially, this kind of product can also be exposed to adverse selection. So basically, those farmers who are more likely to claim are more likely to take up the insurance product in the first place. Yeah. Okay. And then finally, some other lessons on the product development has been, some interesting or relevant results has been that it's possible to have meso level, so that's basically a company or institutional level index insurance products, which might be so. These are products which may not be purchased by the farmers, and where the premium may not be paid by farmers at all, but they might be paid by other entities. So such products have been operational in Bangladesh, where institutions like Oxfam or the World Food Programme have taken out these types of products as a way of funding their disaster relief. So when there's a major flood in specific areas, they would expect an insurance payout from the insurance company. And then they would actually use that payout as part of their disaster relief to the communities who are affected by the flood. So this is really a meso level product or a portfolio level product, not an individual level product. So this kind of product could be interesting or relevant in Vietnam, potentially, because a lot of the risks are also similar in terms of major floods, for example, with a very high frequency, which might be too expensive for individuals to insure on their own, but it might be feasible for an institution to insure potentially. And it can also be an efficient way of funding disaster relief in some cases. One of the other considerations has been basis risk. That's been a key challenge across all categories of index insurance products in all the countries. Um, Basis risk doesn't mean that index insurance products cannot be done, but it means that in the product design, in the use of data, in the types of products which are done, we must think of basis risk, or basis risk should be kept in mind when we are developing these types of products. Um, One of the other factors we see that actually, interestingly, in a lot of countries in Asia, relatively the potential for using satellite data or other forms of remote sensing um, is has not been utilized as much as it could be. So there's a lot of different sources of satellite data available, different types of parameters which are monitored. Usually the satellite data is available for many years, on excess of 20 years, for example. The data is available on a timely basis going forward. So there is more scope of leveraging on satellite data, and we'll talk more about data tomorrow as well. There is also scope of improving indemnity insurance products. So, for example, improving the risk assessment of these products, the pricing of the products, or the monitoring of the claims of these products. And it's possible to improve these using technology, and also using remote sensing or satellite data potentially. The data availability, especially when it comes to agriculture data, is a major challenge. And so the role of the Ministry of Agriculture is really critical in order to provide data efficiently. Also, really important for the Ministry of Agriculture to provide good quality extension services, which can, of course, help as a way of risk management for the farmers, of course. And also, good risk management can actually make many of these risks insurable in the first place, which otherwise the risks may not be insurable without good risk management being followed. Then, if we move to a few other last examples before I hand over to Tin. Um, Now, one of the key success factors where schemes have done relatively well is how efficiently are they actually reaching the farmers. So, in other words, the distribution channels which have been used for reaching the farmers. So, we were mentioning earlier about the framework, and if you remember, there's the agriculture value chain, you have different types of entities there. So let's look at a few quick examples where these entities have actually played a role in terms of being an effective distribution channel for insurance companies to be able to reach a large number of farmers quite cost efficiently. So one example I'm very familiar with in Zambia is the contract farming systems. So in Zambia, actually, quite a few contract farming companies operating outgrower schemes have been very instrumental in a large number of farmers being reached. And this has been going on since about 2013 now, so about 8 years. So there's a company called NWK Agri Services that's now known as Louis Dreyfus Commodities, or LDC. And LDC, they've basically been offering weather index insurance for risks like drought and excessive rainfall, bundled with funeral insurance as well, to their small scale farmers. In particular, these are farmers who are receiving farming inputs on credit. So when farmers receive the inputs, they also have an option on whether they want insurance or not. So insurance is treated like another input that the farmer is receiving. If the farmer wants insurance, it's done on a purely voluntary basis. That's one option, and another company is doing it on a mandatory basis. But if it is done on a voluntary basis, the farmer can choose whether they want insurance or not. And in that case, LDC will actually pay the premium itself. So LDC does not subsidize the premium, but it pre-finances the premium on behalf of the farmers. Yep. So it pays the premium, and this is a quite an interesting impact of this is that the take up rate of the insurance product is quite high, relatively speaking. So in some seasons, it's been as high as 75% in one of the seasons where a large number of farmers took up the product. But of course, another reason for the high take up in that year was that farmers were expecting a drought to occur. which it did occur. So yeah, so there was an element of adverse selection that also happened there. But anyway, so the pre-financing of the premium is quite important success factor here. So there are no premium subsidies involved as of now in Zambia, but the premium is pre-financed by the contract farming company, and indeed also with other types of aggregators like financial institutions and others in Zambia. In most cases, they pre-finance the premium on behalf of the farmers and recover from the farmers afterwards. Um, Now, the value being insured is actually been the input cost over here. So it's not the full cost of production or the expected revenue. It's just the input cost. And it's just related to the inputs that the company has given on credit to the farmers. So over the years, there's been fairly good success with in terms of number of farmers being covered, relatively speaking. So yeah, so in excess of 200,000 farmers have been insured under this model cumulatively over the last eight years. Um, and one of the interesting things we've also seen is that because of having the insurance product, there's been consistently high levels of loan recovery and of deliveries. So there's a few reasons for that. One is that potentially because the insurance product pays out in the bad seasons, that helps with the companies recovering some of the outstanding credit. But the other reason is even more interesting, that some of the farmers have actually become more loyal to the company. So they are actually delivering more crops to the company. They are side selling or side marketing the crops less. So they are not selling to other companies so much because they are receiving this insurance product through the company. So it's essentially acting as a kind of incentive for the farmers to continue in this arrangement. Of course, the contract farming companies are playing quite many roles here in terms of premium pre-financing, probably the most crucial role in terms of enrolling farmers, awareness raising, promoting the product, also in reflecting the claims payouts to the farmers. So when a payout is made, it's actually made to the company, and then the company reflects that payout to the farmers. It also plays a role in terms of negotiating on the product structure and design and the pricing on behalf of the farmers. Right. Um, and then in the next slide we have another model. This one from Kenya now, and this is related to the farming inputs that Tin was referring to earlier in the morning. So just to cover this one quite quickly, because I think we have more material to cover. Basically, in Kenya, some seed companies have been able to bundle insurance with the seeds that they are selling. So in this case, what they did was use insurance as a kind of like a marketing tool for selling the seeds. So this has also been referred to as a freemium product sometimes because the cost of the product is not separately is not always separately seen. It's bundled within the cost of the seeds itself. Um, for doing this, they also used mobile technology. So, for example, farmers could register for the product by using a policy registration card and using SMS. And essentially, what was being covered is failed germination after they've bought their seed. So, if after buying the seed, if there was a drought or a dry spell in the first month or so after buying the seed, then that could trigger a payout. And in that case, the payout would actually go to from the insurance company to the seed companies, and then the seed companies would use that money for giving discounts or free bags of seeds, depending on what they wanted to give to the farmers. So this has been used as a kind of marketing tool for some input suppliers in Africa. This has also happened in quite a few other countries over the years. But for the farmers, it's still an interesting value proposition, because if they have a problem early on in the season, they can actually use the subsidized seeds or the free bags of seeds for planting again. So it enables them to replant quickly. and also to get a quick experience of insurance through doing that. So potentially they might have the appetite for um, products with better coverage, with higher coverage going forward. Yeah, so it's been seen more as a sort of an introductory insurance product. And finally, some quick examples related to insurance linked to finance or credit. So there's a few examples here from different countries. Again, the context of Africa here. So without going into all of the details, but essentially in all these countries, we've seen that banks of different types, they have bundled insurance, in particular weather index insurance, with crop loans. So when they're giving out specific agricultural loans, on a mandatory basis, insurance has also been there. What's interesting is sometimes these products have been initiated by the financial institutions, and sometimes they've also been initiated by the farmer organizations. So, for example, in Tanzania, there was a farmer organization which actually approached the insurance companies, and they asked for a product which they could use as a form of for an insurance product that they could use as a form of soft collateral for actually getting the loan from Barclays Absa Bank. Um, Again, in other cases, say in the case in Zambia or in Rwanda, the banks actually used the insurance products as a way of reducing their credit exposure before they felt confident enough to lend in these markets. So in these cases, the distribution channels, be it the banks or be it the farmer organizations, they play a key role in terms of the distribution of the insurance product, bundling the insurance with the agricultural loans, in supplying sufficient data for the insurance risk assessment to take place. They also play a key role in pre-financing the premiums, so paying the premiums on the farmer's behalf, facilitating the claim payouts, negotiating with the insurance companies on the product design and pricing as well. And finally, the last slide I wanted to cover here was on some of the aspects related to, well, from the perspectives of the insurance companies and the regulatory perspectives as well. I think on the insurance companies' perspective, we'll be covering more of this also tomorrow when we look at some more details related to the specific products in Vietnam. But overall, we see that it's really important to engage with private sector insurance companies to bring them on board, just as it's also important to engage with the private sector distribution channels, and of course also the public sector distribution channels and insurance companies. So it's really important for both public and private sector to cooperate for these types of schemes. Typically, the claims ratios when it comes to indemnity insurance have been very high for small scale farmers. And this is why in most countries in Asia, also in Africa, it's quite difficult for purely indemnity based products to continue. However, there are some exceptions where they're still going on. Um, the claims ratios might be more viable when it comes to weather index and yield index products. So, in other words, it might be more viable for insurance companies to implement index insurance products rather than indemnity insurance products. Um, and ideally, we see that in countries like in Canada, Japan, South Korea, Spain, USA, claims ratios have been quite high, between 70 to 90%, which is indicating that, yeah, they should be quite good value for money for farmers because the claims ratios are high. At the same time, they are not in excess of 100%. But the moment you have claims ratios reaching maybe around 80% upwards, it can already be kind of loss making for insurance companies because they also have their expense margin and other expenses that they have to incur. So you can see that these insurance products have not been hugely profitable in these countries, but yeah, they're still viable in these countries also taking into account the premium subsidies, of course. And finally, on a few aspects on the legislation and regulations. So we see that in some countries, agriculture insurance has been implemented on a mandatory basis for all farmers receiving agricultural loans. For example, this has been the case in India, in specific states or regions. Agriculture insurance is basically a mandatory requirement for farmers who are receiving agricultural loans. Um, we've also seen that in some countries it's done on a purely voluntary basis. It's not mandatory. And in some countries it's a combination of the voluntary and mandatory basis. So it's a part voluntary, part mandatory. It's quite important for there to be specific insurance regulations related to agricultural insurance and also to index insurance products, including index insurance products. Um, this is not always a prerequisite to introduce products because, often an insurance regulator would say that, okay, if you don't have the products there in the first place, how do you know what regulations to have? And the regulations also should not be too burdensome, so it makes it difficult for insurance companies to innovate or to actually start products. But I think once the products have started in maybe a limited way, then it's quite important to have a regulatory framework. And that should be focusing both on the guidelines for insurance companies to enable that they can continue doing this kind of product going forward, as well as it should have consumer protection aspects for both the farmers as well as the legal representatives of the farmers, such as the distribution channels potentially. So there are some preliminary guidelines on the regulatory framework in place as well in some countries like Philippines, Uganda, Nigeria, and so on. Okay, I think I will stop here and hand back to Tin for the next session. Thank you.
Cảm ơn anh Krotos rất là nhiều. Tôi xin nhắc lại một chút là các anh chị nếu mà có các cái câu hỏi cho Krotos thì ngay từ bây giờ có thể viết vào cái chat box thì chúng tôi sẽ tổng hợp và trả lời. Về phần tiếp theo thì vừa rồi thì tất cả các anh các chị đã đi một vòng thế giới rồi, từ châu Âu sang châu Á rồi châu Phi, châu Mỹ, Mỹ Latin đi hết rồi. Chưa đề cập nhiều đến châu Úc hay sao đấy, nhưng mà chúng ta đi rất là nhiều rồi. Bây giờ chúng ta quay trở lại Việt Nam để xem là chúng ta có gì. Thì trong cái phần trình bày đối với các sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp Việt Nam ấy, thì vì không có thời gian cho nên là buổi hôm nay thì chúng tôi sẽ tập trung vào cái bảo hiểm lúa gạo. Còn ngày mai thì chúng tôi sẽ trình bày tiếp một số các sản phẩm liên quan đến chăn nuôi và nuôi trồng thủy sản. Thì hiện nay thì về mặt tổng thể thì có 3 sản phẩm đã được phê duyệt, được Bộ Tài chính phê duyệt từ tháng 5 năm 2020. Ngoài 3 sản phẩm phê duyệt này thì thực tế thì có một số các sản phẩm thí điểm khác nữa. Đấy, ví dụ như là sản phẩm chăn nuôi bò sữa của Abic, công ty bảo hiểm của Ngân hàng Nông nghiệp thì đang triển khai ở Lâm Đồng, hay là Ngân hàng bảo hiểm của quân đội cũng triển khai một số các sản phẩm như, nếu tôi nhớ không nhầm, đấy là một số các sản phẩm lâm nghiệp như trên cây lâm nghiệp. Thì nhưng mà trong cái phạm vi trình bày của chúng tôi thì chúng tôi sẽ tập trung vào các cái sản phẩm mà nó được dựa trên các cái chính sách đã được ban hành, hỗ trợ các chính sách hỗ trợ của chính phủ. Thì hiện nay thì có 3 sản phẩm. Đấy là sản phẩm bảo hiểm chỉ số năng suất lúa gạo. Thì cái sản phẩm này chúng ta áp dụng cái hình thức là bảo hiểm chỉ số năng suất. Cái thứ hai là bảo hiểm chăn nuôi, thì trong đấy có bảo hiểm chăn nuôi trâu, bò thì có bò sữa, bò thịt. Và bảo hiểm thủy sản thì chúng ta đang có bảo hiểm trên tôm sú và tôm thẻ. Thì thực tế thì các cái sản phẩm này là sản phẩm đã được phê duyệt, tức là có thể nó vẫn chưa được triển khai trên thực tế, tức là các sản phẩm này có thể vẫn chưa được bán. Đặc biệt là khi chúng tôi đi đến một số các cái tỉnh thì khi hỏi về các sản phẩm bảo hiểm thì họ bảo là các doanh nghiệp cũng đã xuống, nhưng mà cũng gặp một số các thắc mắc, đặc biệt là trong đồng bằng sông Cửu Long đối với sản phẩm tôm ấy, thì nếu mà có cái thông tin gì update thì mong đặc biệt là các cái doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm bên Bảo Việt có thể chia sẻ thêm với chúng tôi về các cái sản phẩm này. Về trợ cấp phí thì theo quyết định 22 của Thủ tướng Chính phủ năm 2019 thì cái mức trợ cấp này cũng chính là mức trợ cấp cho các cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm đã được phê duyệt hiện nay. Đấy là 90% cho hộ nghèo và hộ cận nghèo, và khoảng 20% cho hộ thường và các tổ chức sản xuất. Các tổ chức sản xuất thì phải đáp ứng được một số các cái điều kiện cơ bản, thì trong quyết định 22 cũng nêu rất là rõ. Và các cái sản phẩm này thì đang được áp dụng trên 19 tỉnh thành phố của cả nước. Trong đấy thì có một tỉnh là tỉnh Nghệ An thì áp dụng cùng lúc là sản phẩm bảo hiểm lúa gạo và bảo hiểm chăn nuôi. Thì đấy là cái bức tranh tổng thể của các cái sản phẩm đã được Bộ Tài chính phê duyệt sau theo các cái quyết định mới đây của Chính phủ tại Việt Nam. Về bảo hiểm lúa gạo thì theo cái quyết định 58 năm 2018 về bảo hiểm nông nghiệp của Chính phủ thì Chính phủ khuyến khích các doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm phát triển các cái sản phẩm đối với lúa gạo, cao su, hồ tiêu, điều, cà phê, cây ăn quả, rau quả và không giới hạn cái phạm vi bảo hiểm, tức là không giới hạn tỉnh nào cả. Cái đấy là tùy thuộc vào các doanh nghiệp đề xuất. Thì tuy nhiên thì trong cái quyết định 22 của Thủ tướng Chính phủ để mà thực hiện cái nghị định 58 này ấy, và sau này thì có một cái quyết định 03 là để mà bổ sung, thì cái này tôi sẽ nói rõ hơn ở cái phần các cái chính sách. Tuy nhiên thì theo các cái quyết định này thì hiện nay ấy, thì nhà nước sẽ chỉ hỗ trợ bảo hiểm, ưu đãi bảo hiểm lúa gạo áp dụng cho 7 tỉnh bao gồm Thái Bình, Nghệ An, Nam Định, Hà Tĩnh, Bình Thuận, An Giang và Đồng Tháp. Thì trên cơ sở như vậy thì đấy là lý do tại sao mà hiện nay chỉ có các cái doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm đang đề xuất và đã được phê chuẩn cái bảo hiểm lúa là cái sản phẩm duy nhất mà trong cái ngành lĩnh vực trồng trọt. Thì đối với các cái rủi ro của bảo hiểm thì thực tế về rủi ro về trợ cấp thì các cái phê duyệt của Bộ Tài chính thì với lại các cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm thì nó khá tương đồng về các rủi ro. Thì trong quyết định 22 năm 2019 thì cũng bao gồm các cái rủi ro này đối với lúa. Thì có thể thấy rằng là các cái rủi ro thì nó rất là nhiều, cái tính bao phủ về rủi ro của sản phẩm lúa hiện nay của chúng ta rất là lớn, đặc biệt là các rủi ro liên quan đến thiên tai. Việc bao phủ cái rủi ro lớn ấy, thì nó có những cái điểm mạnh nhưng mà nó cũng có các cái điểm yếu của nó. Thì điểm mạnh của nó là gì? Là cái tính hấp dẫn của sản phẩm nó sẽ cao, bởi vì cái độ phủ nó cao, nhưng mà điểm yếu của nó là cái giá sản phẩm nó sẽ tăng và ảnh hưởng đến khả năng chi trả của người dân. Đặc biệt là cái thứ hai nữa là nhiều các cái rủi ro, đặc biệt là thiên tai trong này thì nó ảnh hưởng bởi cái địa lý và cái khu vực rất là nhiều. Thành ra là trong cái quá trình mà nâng cao nhận thức cho người dân thì mình có thể sẽ gặp một số các cái câu hỏi mà mình sẽ rất là khó để trả lời cho họ. Ví dụ như là một người nông dân ở Hà Giang hỏi doanh nghiệp là tại sao ông lại đi 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 bảo hiểm sóng thần cho tôi, ở đây làm gì có sóng thần. Vấn đề là nếu như một doanh nghiệp đứng trên góc độ doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm thì nếu như trả lời là đấy là do quy định của chính sách thì nó cũng không thuyết phục cho lắm, bởi vì cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm là do các doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm quyết định. Tuy nhiên thì đấy là các cái điểm mạnh và điểm yếu. Thì đối với các cái rủi ro thiên tai này để mà được bảo hiểm thì cần phải có xác nhận và công bố thiên tai và xác nhận thiên tai. Thì năm ngoái thì Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển nông thôn cũng ban hành một cái thông tư là thông tư 09 để mà hướng dẫn cho các địa phương trong việc công bố và xác nhận thiên tai để phục vụ cho công tác bảo hiểm. Thì trong đấy cũng có một số các cái rủi ro thì không được bảo hiểm, đặc biệt là các cái rủi ro từ việc cố ý gây thiệt hại hay là tổn thất sau thu hoạch, hay là chất lượng kém, hay là chiến tranh hay rơi thiên thạch, thì những cái đấy là những cái mà được loại trừ ra khỏi cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm này. Tôi giải thích lại một chút, tại vì cái phần này thì anh Tốt cũng trình bày khá là kỹ về cái định nghĩa và các cái điểm mạnh, điểm yếu của bảo hiểm chỉ số năng suất lúa gạo rồi, năng suất rồi. Nhưng mà ở đây thì tôi muốn nêu lên một số các cái vấn đề thực tế nữa diễn ra ở trên địa phương, các địa phương để các anh các chị có thể nắm thêm các thông tin liên quan đến việc triển khai các cái hoạt động này ở trên địa phương, trên thực địa. Thì cái bảo hiểm chỉ số năng suất lúa gạo của Việt Nam thì áp dụng cái công nghệ viễn thám để mà tính toán chỉ số. Sau cái này thì tôi sẽ giải thích cái công nghệ đấy nó sẽ hoạt động như thế nào. Về về định nghĩa thì anh Tốt có nêu rồi, là nó hoạt động như thế nào rồi. Cái năng suất được bảo hiểm hiện nay là 90%, tức là nếu như cái thiệt hại trên 10% thì cái bồi thường sẽ được kích hoạt. Ở đây tại sao lại là bảo hiểm chỉ số năng suất lúa? Tại vì là cái năng suất lúa này có thể được theo dõi trong thời gian dài và liên tục, khiến cho cái bộ cơ sở dữ liệu của mình khá là tốt để phục vụ cho cái công tác bảo hiểm. Cái thứ hai là giảm được cái chi phí nghiệp vụ, thì cái này anh Tốt cũng trình bày rồi, và giảm cái rủi ro về mặt đạo đức. Cái vấn đề của bảo hiểm hiện nay ấy, thì nó có mấy vấn đề. Cái thứ nhất là cái tính chính xác của cái công nghệ so với thực tiễn, và nó gây ra các cái rủi ro cơ sở. Ờ, tôi giải thích một chút rủi ro cơ sở là gì. Rủi ro cơ sở là khi mà cái rủi ro và cái thiệt hại nó diễn ra, nhưng mà có thể là người nông dân không được nhận tiền bồi thường mặc dù họ đã mua bảo hiểm. Và rủi ro cơ sở này nó, đúng không ạ, thì thực tế là vì cái công nghệ này cho nên rủi ro cơ sở khi mà triển khai cái bảo hiểm nông nghiệp này thì đã xảy ra rủi ro cơ sở vào năm ngoái, và cái này cũng làm đau đầu rất nhiều bên liên quan. Bởi bên liên quan bao gồm cả doanh nghiệp, cả các cơ quan quản lý. Cái tranh luận rất là lớn đối với nông dân, và hiện nay thì mới giải quyết được theo như thông tin tôi nhận được. Thì cái này nó đến bởi vì là khi mà áp dụng công nghệ viễn thám thì tính sai cái năng suất thực tế. Bởi vì khi khi áp dụng công nghệ viễn thám thì dựa vào màu sắc và người ta ước lượng ra được cái cái năng suất. Tuy nhiên khi mà theo dõi như vậy thì ở bên dưới thì thực ra là năng suất, màu sắc rất là đẹp nếu như nhìn từ vệ tinh, nhưng mà thực ra ở dưới lại là lép. Cho nên là trên thực tế thì người dân được bồi thường, nhưng mà khi mà tính toán ra thì khi mà tính toán theo cái công nghệ thì năng suất lại không phải là năng suất được bồi thường. Thành ra nó xảy ra các tình trạng này, và 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 hình như là mới mới xử lý được, và bây giờ doanh nghiệp lại chấp nhận bồi thường cho người dân theo cái năng suất thực tế. Thì tôi nghĩ rằng cái này thì chúng ta cũng có thể xử lý được bằng việc là xem lại và cải tiến lại các cái mô hình ở trong cái công nghệ của mình. Và hoặc là thứ hai nữa là có thể là mình sẽ phải kết hợp giữa cái công nghệ viễn thám và một số các cái công nghệ mặt đất để theo dõi và kết hợp để xác định dịch bệnh. Cái thứ ba nữa là nhận thức của nông dân để giải thích cho người nông dân hiểu được, chấp nhận được một số sản phẩm như thì cái này anh Tốt cũng trình bày rồi. Ở đây là một cái giải thích về cái công nghệ tính toán về năng suất được bảo hiểm. Thì cái công nghệ này nó cũng tương đối là đơn giản, nó dựa vào cái bản đồ được chụp bởi ảnh vệ tinh. Thì cái bản đồ vệ tinh nó sẽ chụp, các có thể thấy và quy hoạch và thiết kế nông nghiệp áp dụng thông qua cái dự án RISE, và nó sẽ chụp các ảnh vệ tinh để xem xét là màu sắc và cái độ phủ của thảm thực vật. Thì từ cái hình ảnh này á, thì sẽ đưa vào để mà xử lý và chạy cái mô hình sinh trưởng của lúa, tức là chạy cái mô hình sinh trưởng để xem xét là cái màu sắc và cái độ phù như vậy thì nó sẽ ảnh hưởng tới năng suất như thế nào, và từ đấy thì nó sẽ ước lượng ra được cái năng suất. Thì cái năng suất đấy chính là cái năng suất mà bây giờ mình đang áp dụng để mà trong các cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm hiện nay. Thì nó xảy ra một số vấn đề như tôi vừa trình bày đấy. Về chủ hợp đồng và thời hạn về phí bảo hiểm á. Chủ hợp đồng thì ở đây để mà giảm cái chi phí nghiệp vụ và giảm các cái đầu mối thì nông dân có thể ủy quyền cho người đại diện của mình ký hợp đồng, và cái này cũng khá là phổ biến ở trên thực tế, rằng là ví dụ như một thôn thì có thể là trưởng thôn hoặc là chủ nhiệm hợp tác xã có thể thay mặt người nông dân để ký. Thì khi ký hợp đồng ủy quyền như vậy thì rõ ràng là người nông dân phải ký một giấy ủy quyền cho người đại diện của mình, và khi mà có bồi thường thì chủ hợp đồng, tức là người đại diện, sẽ nhận cái tiền bồi thường đấy và phân phối lại cho người dân. Lúa hiện nay thì được bảo hiểm trong vòng 1 năm, bảo hiểm 1 năm, nhưng mà nó có giá trị trong một mùa vụ, tức là từ khi gieo cấy và đến khi kết thúc thu hoạch thì sẽ kết thúc ạ. Tức là ngay cả công đoạn gieo nếu như bị thiệt hại thì cũng có thể được bồi thường, nhưng mà cái bồi thường trong đoạn gieo thì nó sẽ được tách ra khỏi cái vấn đề về mặt năng suất. Ví dụ như là khi mà trên 5 hectare ở một khu vực mà phải gieo cấy lại thì các doanh nghiệp bồi thường sẽ bồi thường khoảng 5% giá trị của bảo hiểm. Và sau đấy đến cuối một vụ nếu như mà tiếp tục lại được bồi thường thì cái 5% đấy sẽ được trừ lại. Nếu như mà chính sách này hết hiệu lực thì sẽ được kéo dài cho đến cái ngày mà mình thu hoạch. Cái bảng ở bên tay phải đấy là tỷ lệ phí bảo hiểm. Nó dao động từ khoảng 3,2 cho đến 5,7 cho đến 6,3. Thì nhìn chung thì rõ ràng là các cái tỉnh phía Bắc thì thường có tỷ lệ phí cao hơn khá nhiều so với các tỉnh phía Nam, bởi vì các tỉnh phía Bắc thì các cái rủi ro về mặt thiên tai nó lớn hơn rất là nhiều, đặc biệt là bão, áp thấp nhiệt đới. Và thì đấy là lý do tại sao có cái sự chênh lệch khá lớn về tỷ lệ phí bảo hiểm giữa các cái tỉnh. Cuối cùng thì tôi đề cập một chút về cái quy trình bồi thường bảo hiểm. Quy trình bồi thường bảo hiểm này thì đầu tiên nếu như mà có thiên tai hoặc là có rủi ro xảy ra thì trong vòng 24 giờ thì người dân sẽ phải báo cho doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm và chính quyền địa phương để mà họ nắm được thông tin. Thì sau đấy chính quyền địa phương sẽ dựa vào cái thông tư 09 của Bộ Chính của Bộ Nông nghiệp và Phát triển Nông thôn thì sẽ xác nhận và hoặc là công bố cái rủi ro từ chính quyền địa phương. Nhưng mà vấn đề là khi bồi thường thì cái này bồi thường dựa vào thiệt hại, và thiệt hại chỉ tính toán được thiệt hại năng suất chỉ được tính toán được khi mà thu hoạch, cho nên là phải chờ đến cuối vụ và xem xét cái dữ liệu được tính toán từ các cái dữ liệu vệ tinh, thì sau đấy sẽ bồi thường cho người nông dân. Thì ở giữa đấy là một cái công thức để tính toán cái tổn thất được bồi thường, thì nó cũng đơn giản, nhưng mà ở đây có một cái điểm tôi muốn nhấn mạnh, đấy là cái giảm trừ của bảo hiểm nông nghiệp và của bảo hiểm lúa gạo tối đa có thể lên tới 20%. Trong bảo hiểm thì bảo hiểm nông nghiệp nó có hai cái khái niệm rất là quan trọng, đấy là khấu trừ và giảm trừ. Khấu trừ có nghĩa là cái khoản mà người dân là phải giữ lại, coi như một phần rủi ro mà người sản xuất phải giữ lại, thì cái đấy nó sẽ làm giảm chi phí và làm tăng cái ý thức trong cái việc bảo vệ tài sản của người nông dân và quản lý cái rủi ro của người nông dân. Nhưng mà cái khái niệm thứ hai là khái niệm giảm trừ, thì cái này là do các cái doanh nghiệp và do người nông dân nếu như mà các cái thiệt hại xảy ra do lỗi của người nông dân, do có một phần lỗi của người nông dân, thì doanh nghiệp hoàn toàn có thể giảm trừ và lên tới tối đa 20% giá trị bảo hiểm. Thì thực tế mình cũng khi mà bọn tôi nghiên cứu về cái chương trình bảo hiểm nông nghiệp năm giai đoạn 2011-2013 ấy, thì cái nghiên cứu được thực hiện vào năm 2015-2016, thì chúng tôi thấy rằng là nếu mà xét ra thì doanh nghiệp đa số các trường hợp doanh nghiệp đều có thể giảm trừ, bởi vì ngay từ các cái điều kiện ban đầu và tuân thủ cái quy trình đối với hộ nghèo, hộ cận nghèo là rất là hạn chế. Bởi vậy là rất dễ bị giảm trừ, nhưng mà thực ra là nếu mà kích hoạt các điều khoản giảm trừ này thì sẽ gây tranh cãi rất là nhiều giữa doanh nghiệp với người nông dân. Và các anh chị biết rồi, văn hóa Việt Nam mà doanh nghiệp mà đi cãi nhau với nông dân thì về lý có thể doanh nghiệp thắng, nhưng mà thiệt thòi thì bao giờ cũng về phía doanh nghiệp. Cho nên là cái này là cũng là cái mà chúng ta nên cần phải giải thích rõ nếu như mà gặp nông dân. Sau khi mà có các cái dữ liệu tính toán và kích hoạt bồi thường thì sẽ nông dân sẽ phải hoàn thiện, chủ hợp đồng sẽ phải hoàn thiện hồ sơ bảo hiểm và nộp cho công ty bảo hiểm. Thì sau 15 ngày khi đầy đủ hồ sơ thì doanh nghiệp sẽ bồi thường bảo hiểm. Đấy là một số các cái điểm chính về bảo hiểm lúa gạo. Còn nếu như các anh các chị có muốn tìm hiểu thêm thì trong cái cuốn tài liệu mà chúng tôi gửi đến các anh các chị cũng tương đối rõ, và nếu như có các cái câu hỏi nữa thì chúng tôi có thể trả lời hoặc gửi thêm một số các cái tài liệu để các anh chị tham khảo. Thì thời gian bây giờ nó cũng quá mất rồi, thì tôi xin phép đi luôn vào cái phần thảo luận. Thì như tôi đã trình bày á, thì như tôi đã trình bày thì chúng ta có hai cách để thảo luận. Một là chúng ta có thể viết câu hỏi vào cái box chat, hai là chúng ta có thể bấm vào raise hand và chúng tôi có thể phát biểu trực tiếp. Và chúng tôi cũng rất là khuyến khích các cái bên liên quan, đặc biệt là các doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm, có thể đóng góp thêm các cái ý kiến của mình trong cái để mà tất cả mọi người có thể hiểu rõ hơn và có nhiều thông tin hơn về cái hoạt động bảo hiểm nông nghiệp hiện nay. Thì hiện nay thì chúng tôi nhận được 3 câu hỏi ở trên chat box. Thì một số các câu hỏi chúng tôi sẽ chuyển đến cho anh Agotot trước. Đấy là một câu hỏi của anh
Sorry, Tin.
Hồ Ngọc Cường đến từ Học viện Nông nghiệp Việt Nam, có hỏi là mong diễn giả chia sẻ kinh nghiệm và tài liệu liên quan tới đánh giá tổn thất trong nuôi trồng thủy sản khi xảy ra thiệt hại, khi xảy ra rủi ro, để làm căn cứ để đền bù tổn thất. Thì câu hỏi này tôi xin chuyển lại cho anh Autot. Xin mời anh ạ.
Sorry, Tin. I think there's a. I couldn't actually hear the English translation on the
Anh
integration.
Autot không nghe được translate, không nghe được phiên dịch.
All right, so
Autot, can
Yes,
you
I can
hear?
hear you. Yes, yes. Yeah, sure. Thanks. So yeah. So regarding the on the aquaculture, so we have some material, I think, in the pamphlets which have been developed on. So there's a specific pamphlet on aquaculture, which includes all the details about the aquaculture product in Vietnam, as well as the process for the loss assessment and how the claim amount is calculated and so on. So we have that in the pamphlets, and then I believe also in the manual we have that. We'll also be covering aquaculture in more detail tomorrow. We'll be going into the aquaculture product in more detail. Apart from that, I mean, I don't have access to like the general guidelines for aquaculture loss assessments in other countries as such. So I think the information that we could be discussing more is the information related to Vietnam, both in the materials and then also in the session tomorrow. Thank you. I don't know if that helps, or if Tin, if you want to add anything more on that.
Vâng, câu hỏi tiếp theo rất là hay đến từ chị Nguyễn Thị Minh Thu từ Học viện Nông nghiệp Việt Nam. Đấy là nhìn chung thì nông dân đang sợ tốn tiền nên không mua bảo hiểm. Vậy làm sao để nông dân sợ tốn nhiều tiền để mua bảo hiểm? Diễn giả có thể chia sẻ về tỷ lệ dành cho marketing sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp của các quốc gia trên thế giới và cơ chế truyền thông sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp được cho là hiệu quả của một số quốc gia. Thì câu hỏi này tôi cũng xin chuyển đến anh Autos.
Okay, yeah, sure. Good question. So I think in terms of the marketing, yeah, I mean, I don't really have specific estimates of the marketing cost in the other countries. But then I think the statistic that Tin had shared earlier on the cost in USA on the research and development and implementation expenses, that gives a good idea. But generally, with the awareness raising of farmers, there are different ways of doing that. So firstly, I think related to the point of the farmers not wanting to spend on agriculture insurance. I mean, that's completely understandable, and that's what happens pretty much everywhere. I think the ways of communicating the value to the farmers, it's around different things. So firstly, to have an awareness raising with maybe with extension staff, also raising awareness through other field operatives that the farmer is interacting with. So that could be the field, say, agriculture dealers, or it could be the staff of the financial institution which is financing the farmers, or agribusinesses. So basically, with interactions with these field operatives is another way to communicate with the farmers. And then, of course, there has been lots of different ways in which the communication has happened using, for example, radio channels, or using mass media, using social media as well in some countries. They use, for example, using mediums like Facebook and so on, works in some countries where uh, people access Facebook a lot and so on. So yeah, so there's different forms of media which can be used over here for the awareness raising. But I think at the end of the day, also a very effective form of marketing is basically after there has been an initial experience of the insurance product, and if the product has actually paid out as it was supposed to, and the farmers are happy about the payout and so on, then that can also be used as an opportunity to market the product. So it's not just like a marketing story, but it's a genuine experience of what farmers have experienced and so on. So I think those are some of the different options. But I think as an estimate of the cost, I don't really have an estimate myself. Maybe Tin, if you want to add anything on that.
Trong câu hỏi này thì tôi cũng không có nhiều kinh nghiệm trong vấn đề marketing các sản phẩm bảo hiểm cho đến nay. Tôi có nhiều kinh nghiệm hơn trong cái trong vấn đề nghiên cứu về các sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp, nghiên cứu đánh giá về chính sách. Tuy nhiên thì cái này thì tôi chỉ có một cái vấn đề liên quan đến cái là sợ tốn tiền nên không mua bảo hiểm, và sợ tốn nhiều tiền nên mua bảo hiểm. Thì thực ra là cái vấn đề của mình là vấn đề về nhận thức mà thôi. Nếu như người dân và có thể có nhận thức tốt và có cái hiểu biết tốt, và họ xem các cái công cụ tài chính trở thành một cái công cụ hữu hiệu cho cái quản lý rủi ro của họ, thì tôi nghĩ rằng họ sẽ dễ dàng chấp nhận để mà chấp nhận các cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp hiện nay. Và đồng thời thì các cái doanh nghiệp cũng có thể cung cấp một số các cái sản phẩm tốt và cung cấp nhiều lựa chọn cho người nông dân để họ ở các cái mức độ thu nhập khác nhau thì họ có thể lựa chọn các cái sản phẩm khác nhau để mà đa dạng hóa cái nhu cầu của họ. Thì đấy là ý kiến của tôi. Anh Ao Tốt có bổ sung thêm gì không ạ?
No, well, just one other point to add that, I mean, one of the challenges I've seen is also around, regarding the I mean, farmers being reluctant to pay the premium. Sometimes also a cause for the reluctance, also for small scale farmers, even if they really, believe in the product and they want the product. Sometimes the issue is not even to do with affordability, but it's to do with when they have to pay the premium, meaning the timing of the premium payment. Because if you think about it, for farmers who are especially in seasonal types of farming, like say rice farming, and they're expecting they will only earn after they sell the rice at the end of the season. For them to pay a premium, even if it's a small amount of money at the start of the season, is very difficult, but they might be able to pay the premium at the end of the season. So I think this is one of the challenges we also have with agriculture insurance, because we're asking farmers to pay the premium at the start of the season when it's probably the worst time for them to pay any additional money for anything apart from the farming activities and other expenses and so on. So my point is, I think on the affordability to pay, and I think this is the reason why, some of the schemes where pre-financing of premium has happened, where either the government or private sector has financed the premium on behalf of the farmers um, at the start of the season, that has helped with addressing this cash flow challenge that farmers have at the start of the season, or liquidity challenge that farmers have. But again, it's easier said than done, because I mean, especially if a large number of farmers are to be financed, then either the government or the also the private sector would have to pay quite a large premium at the start of the season on behalf of the farmers. So that's also challenging to do. But anyway, but that's another way of thinking about this willingness to pay. That if there are ways in which the premium can be collected, maybe in regular installments or at different times in the year, that could also help with the farmers to actually pay the premium. Yeah.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn anh Ao Tốt. Thực ra là cái này nó cũng liên quan đến một cái điểm lúc sáng mà em đã trình bày, đấy là thực tế thì người ta chỉ thấy cái nhu cầu bảo hiểm tăng cao khi mà trong cái rủi ro nó đến rất là nhiều. Ví dụ như là mình đang gặp cái dịch tả lợn châu Phi chẳng hạn, thì cái khi đấy thì người ta nhu cầu bảo hiểm của người ta sẽ tăng lên rất là cao, và khi đấy họ sẽ sợ mất nhiều tiền. Thực tế là khi mà mọi việc, khi mà sản xuất cứ đều thì cái nhu cầu bảo hiểm rất là khó để đưa vào, đặc biệt là nếu như mà không có các cái hoạt động rất là mạnh mẽ trong vấn đề giáo dục. Tuy nhiên á, thì cái bảo hiểm nó rất là thích hợp khi mà người dân chuyển đổi, tức là khi mà họ đầu tư sang một cái cây trồng khác hoặc là con khác, thì khi họ đầu tư thêm để mà tăng thêm thu nhập, thì khi đấy họ sẽ có nhiều rủi ro hơn và họ sẽ cần bảo hiểm, bởi vì khi đấy là cái nhu cầu của bảo hiểm tăng lên rất là nhiều. Thì ở một số quốc gia thì cái bảo hiểm để cung cấp để cho người dân chuyển đổi cây trồng vật nuôi cũng là một cái giải pháp mà cũng đã được áp dụng và cũng đã được trình bày rất là nhiều. Thì đấy là một cái tiếp theo để làm sao để mà người dân sợ tốn nhiều tiền nên phải mua bảo hiểm. Vâng, xin cảm ơn. Anh Thắng ở công ty Bảo Việt thì có góp ý với chúng tôi rằng là doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm chỉ số theo công nghệ viễn thám sẽ bồi thường theo kết quả chỉ số công nghệ và không bồi thường theo thiệt hại thực tế. Thì đúng là cái này là đúng là như vậy. Nhưng mà khi mà làm việc với nông dân mà mình không rõ thì đến cuối cùng thì nó lại rất là phức tạp phía sau. Bởi vì cái này theo báo cáo của các anh ở bên Bộ Nông nghiệp Phát triển Nông thôn á, thì năm ngoái thì Nghệ An thì xảy ra cái tình trạng như em đã trình bày, tức là ở trên thì năng suất rất là cao khi chiếu xuống, nhưng ở dưới thì hạt nó lép. Cho nên là nếu như áp dụng đúng á, thì nông dân hoàn toàn không được bồi thường gì cả. Nhưng mà vấn đề là họ thiệt hại thật. Như vậy thì họ sẽ khiếu nại, và nông dân khiếu nại thì sẽ rất là rắc rối. Bởi vì đã nông dân khiếu nại chắc chắn doanh nghiệp phải xử lý. Nếu doanh nghiệp không xử lý là cái phần thiệt sẽ luôn ở phía nông nghiệp, về phía doanh nghiệp. Cái đây là thực tế, nó chứng minh hết rồi. Các cái doanh nghiệp trong đồng bằng sông Cửu Long không bao giờ dám đi kiện nông dân hết. Mặc dù kiện họ thắng, ở trên tòa họ thắng, nhưng mà trên thực tế thì thiệt thòi luôn về phía doanh nghiệp. Cho nên là cái sai ở trong bảo hiểm, cái sai lệch về năng suất như vậy ấy, làm nông dân người ta khiếu kiện và người ta phản hồi lên. Cho nên là cũng phải ngồi lại với nhau để xử lý. Còn về mặt nguyên tắc thì đúng như anh có nói, đấy là cái kết quả bồi thường, cái chỉ số đấy nó phải dựa vào công nghệ. Thì cái đấy là chính xác nếu mà tính trong cái quy tắc bảo hiểm ấy. Cái câu hỏi tiếp theo đến từ anh Sơn ở trung tâm thông tin. Thì anh Sơn có hỏi một câu liên quan đến việc là làm sao để mà mình có các cái giải pháp và các cái kinh nghiệm trên thế giới để mà xử lý các cái vấn đề, để rút ngắn cái thời gian thẩm định thiệt hại, thẩm định nguyên nhân thiệt hại trong chăn nuôi. Bởi vì trên thực tế là ở Vĩnh Phúc hồi xưa thì khi mà triển khai diễn ra, khi mà thiệt hại ấy, thì phải mất rất lâu thời gian thì các bên liên quan mới đến để thẩm định. Nhưng mà khi đến nơi thì có khi là hộ đấy phải bán đi rồi, bởi vì nếu mà để quá lâu thì họ không bán được nữa. Thì ở đây câu hỏi chung lại là các cái kinh nghiệm quốc tế và để các biện pháp để mình có thể xử lý cái vấn đề làm sao để thẩm định bồi thường, thẩm định nguyên nhân thiệt hại và bồi thường một cách nhanh nhất cho người nông dân trong bảo hiểm chăn nuôi. Thì xin mời anh Ca Tốt có thể chia sẻ thêm ạ.
Okay, great. So maybe I can start with addressing some of the different questions, and then maybe we can continue. So I think I'll start with the latest one that was mentioned relating to the livestock experience on the claim payout. Yeah, so this is, of course, this is always this is a challenge with with different types of agriculture insurance products. Generally speaking, one advantage of, let's say, index or parametric products is that the payout can happen much more quickly compared to indemnity products. So, for example, if it is in the context of livestock, if it was an index based on, say, vegetation index, or even weather conditions, or maybe based on some natural catastrophes, which can also affect livestock, of course, like flooding and so on. Then, as soon as the event has been recorded, and if the trigger threshold has been breached, then the payout is due. The insurance company is legally liable to make the payout immediately. So it's a much more objective way of doing the payouts, and it can lead to very quick payouts happening. So I mean, I've seen situations where, as soon as the data's been released and the payout is known, in the same week, pretty much the payout is made. And this has also happened in countries in Africa and, of course, in South Asia. But now going back to your question on livestock, I mean, generally speaking, for both crop and livestock, index insurance can lead to quicker payouts. But again, it's not always the case. It's also important to know, because, for example, if it is it depends on how quickly the data is available. So in some cases, we've seen there are still delays of a few months for maybe a claim to be settled for an yield index product, because the yield is only available after a few months. It's not available immediately. So it's not always the case, but generally it's quicker. But now specifically to what you described on livestock, again, it may not be possible to have an index insurance products for all types of risks. So if, for example, here, if this related to the livestock dying because of some disease or for any other reason, it may not be captured by an index directly. So it might have to be on an indemnity basis, where the individual loss is assessed and the payout is based on that. And this also, referring back to the comment from, I think, from the insurance company, that the indemnity coverage can be more comprehensive coverage. And indemnity coverage is also an option, but in that case, it's about how that process can be improved, really. So in the context of livestock, some ways I'm aware of where processes have been improved is, for example, in using technology for monitoring the cattle. So in countries like India and Bangladesh, they use a radio frequency identification device, or RFID. So using that device, it's quite quick to monitor whether the insured cattle has actually died or whether it's some other cattle, and so on. So I think use of technology basically helps in for indemnity assessments as well. And then, of course, another way of addressing quick payment of claims is through ensuring that there is a provision in the insurance policy document relating to quick payment of claims. So again, this is actually an area where the insurance regulator can play a role in terms of, for example, ensuring that the policy documents which are used for insurance products actually have provisions around the time scale within which claims have to be paid, or there's recourse to for complaints to be made, or for in the case of severe delays, it can be escalated to the regulator. So the regulator can also play a role here to ensure that the payouts can happen quickly. Another quick example I can give: in some countries in Africa, with some of the yield index products, there's actually a penalty clause which is incorporated sometimes on the insurance company to say that if the payouts don't happen with it, after a pay and a valid payout is due, if it is not honored within a certain time, then a penalty is applied to the insurer, and the penalty keeps increasing the longer the delay. So there are some ways in which the payouts could be improved. Of course, awareness raising is another big part of it. I think through good awareness raising, even the farmer will know what information is needed for reporting, because sometimes the delay is not necessarily the fault of the insurance companies per se. It could also be that maybe the farmers have not supplied the required information, or there's some gaps in the information which is delaying the whole process. So if there's a lot of awareness raising on what information is needed, how the claims form needs to be filled out, how claims need to be reported, then that's another way of speeding up the claim payments. Yeah. Then just going back to just another question, and I'll hand back to Tin on the question on the with the index insurance product, that there can always be differences between the actual experience on the ground and the satellite estimate. I think yeah, this is really important point to recognize. I think it really comes down to what is the basis of the product. So I know with yield index, for example, um, I think in most cases, yield index, where it's being done, because there are different ways of doing it, but using satellite imagery for estimating yield it's quite difficult, and there's always going to be some areas of errors where the satellite is saying something, but the yield is saying something else, and that's understandable. I mean, if you think of crops, okay, for rice it's a bit more straightforward, but even for rice, I mean, you can have a rice, a rice field looking very green, or I mean, meeting the index parameters, but then in reality the rice formation has not happened properly, or the pollination hasn't happened properly, and so on. So you can have a big difference between the satellite imagery and the actual yield. Having said that, I think the satellite imagery does have a role to play with yield index as well, but maybe ways of dealing with what you just described is maybe having also other provisions. So in the event that there's a clear difference between the satellite index and the experience on the ground, maybe there can be scope for doing an audit, or there can be scope for doing of having a secondary trigger. So there are also some products which are combining, for example, an yield index structure with a weather index structure. So one of the advantages of doing that, of having a hybrid index, is you basically have a higher chance of picking up the event. So yeah, so those are some ways in which you can improve the accuracy of the product. Back to you, Tin.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn anh Tốt. Thực ra là cái ý của anh Sơn ở đây á, thì nhấn mạnh vào cái ý là làm sao để mình đánh giá cái xác minh cái nguyên nhân thiệt hại nhanh nhất, tức là xác minh cái nguyên nhân để xem là nó có nằm trong cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm, cái danh mục rủi ro được bảo hiểm hay không ấy. Thì cái này tôi cũng chia sẻ một chút là thực ra là đây là một cái vấn đề rất là lớn của chăn nuôi Việt Nam, bảo hiểm chăn nuôi của Việt Nam. Cái này đã xảy ra từ cái giai đoạn thí điểm từ trước. Thì khi mà rủi ro nó xảy ra thì nó khác, có lẽ là mình Việt Nam nói với nhau thì rất là dễ hiểu, nhưng anh Tốt thì có thể rất là khó hiểu, bởi vì Việt Nam là rủi ro dịch bệnh xong là phải xác định nhanh để đưa đi bán, còn người ta là không bán được, người ta phải tiêu hủy thì nó dễ hơn, còn mình là nhanh để còn đưa đi bán. Cái thứ hai là cái thời gian thì nó sẽ cho nên là cái thời gian nó rất là gấp, và chính cái vấn đề này ấy, thì nó gây ra các cái rủi ro về mặt đạo đức rất là nhiều. Trục lợi bảo hiểm nó rất dễ xảy ra trong bảo hiểm chăn nuôi trong cái giai đoạn trước đây. Thì cái này nó ảnh hưởng bởi mấy yếu tố thôi. Cái thứ nhất là cái tính linh hoạt của cái hệ thống vận hành ấy. Khi mà rủi ro xảy ra, người phải báo cho thú y, rồi thú y thì phải triệu tập có đầy đủ bảo hiểm, có bên bảo hiểm, có bên phòng kinh tế, có bên thú y địa phương, có ủy ban nhân dân xã, có trưởng thôn, thì để tập hợp được đủ người không là đã mất cả ngày rồi. Cho nên là nó chậm, thì cái này là liên quan đến cái tính linh hoạt của cái hệ thống của mình. Cái thứ hai ấy, là thực tế là nó không chỉ dừng lại ở đấy đâu ạ. Là kể cả khi lấy mẫu rồi ấy, thì cái nguyên nhân chủ yếu cũng chỉ xác nhận bằng trực quan là chính. Là mấy anh bên thú y đến sờ, đến xem là xác nhận nó là cái gì thôi, chứ không, cũng chưa hẳn là một cách chính xác đâu. Bởi vì cái hệ thống để mà kiểm nghiệm ấy, cái hệ thống phòng thí nghiệm ấy, thì hiện nay Việt Nam chỉ có tập trung ở một số ở Hà Nội và thành phố Hồ Chí Minh thôi. Ví dụ như bảo hiểm cho trâu bò mà ở Hà Giang mà đưa được mẫu về Hà Nội rồi xét nghiệm thì chắc cái mẫu ấy nó cũng hỏng mất rồi, bởi vì cái hệ thống để mà hậu cần cho cái việc đấy là mình cũng đang rất là yếu. Cái này không chỉ là là chăn nuôi không đâu, mà thủy sản nó cũng dẫn đến cái tình trạng này, và đấy chính là nguyên nhân mà cái rủi ro đạo đức nó rất là cao. Nên là về giải pháp thì cái này nó cũng rất là khó để mà xử lý. Cái thứ nhất là có thể là mình chuyển qua các hệ thống bảo hiểm chỉ số giống như anh Tốt trình bày. Cái thứ hai là mình có thể phải nghiên cứu một số các cái công cụ, ví dụ như bây giờ Covid thì chỉ cần 15 phút là test xong, mình có thể có các công cụ để mà test các cái sản phẩm đấy trên rất là nhanh, và đưa cái mẫu test đấy về để mà chứng minh rằng cái đấy là do rủi ro dịch bệnh này hay dịch bệnh kia, thì mình cũng có thể làm như thế vậy. hay là cũng có thể nâng cấp cái hệ thống với cái phòng thí nghiệm để mà đảm bảo cái tính chính xác, hoặc là để đảm bảo tính linh hoạt, có thể là mình sẽ thuê một bên thứ ba nào đấy ở cấp địa phương, họ sẽ thực hiện cái việc giám định bồi thường đấy, và không là độc lập đối với các cái bên liên quan để đảm bảo cái tính chính xác. Thì đấy là một số các cái giải pháp. Thì có thể là nếu mà các anh bên cục chăn nuôi mà nếu mà có ý kiến gì thêm mà có thể hỗ trợ được bảo hiểm trong cái việc xác định nhanh chóng cái nguyên nhân dẫn đến tử vong để dẫn đến bồi thường thì có thể bổ sung thêm giúp bọn em. Anh Phong ở Học viện Nông nghiệp Việt Nam có bổ sung thêm một câu hỏi, đấy là với kinh nghiệm của các nước thì bảo hiểm nông nghiệp chia ra nhiều loại như thế nào khi có nhiều loại nông sản khác nhau, mỗi loại rủi ro khác nhau và mức độ tổn thất là khác nhau. Thì cái câu hỏi này xin chuyển cho anh Aotot có thể chia sẻ thêm với mọi người ạ. Xin cảm ơn.
Okay, so in terms of classifying the products, so it's there are still I mean it really depends on the product categories. So the typically the product categories would it would still be kind of similar in terms of crop indemnity, or I mean different types of indemnity insurance, or different types of index insurance products as well. In the case of I know in some countries there's not always a lot of distinction between the product categories. Like they would, for example, they might group crop indemnity and yield index products together, and then weather index might be treated as a different category. But yeah, I mean, essentially, I think there's so if you look at some of the other countries in the region, they use specific categories for their products. Like in Cambodia, for example, the weather index products there are categorized as weather index crop insurance. Yeah, and then there's also the other indemnity products as well. So I don't know if that answers the question, or if you wanted some clarification on that, or maybe if you want to explain the question any further, or Tin, do you want to?
Vâng, xin cảm ơn anh Aotot. Cái này có lẽ là phải nhờ anh Phong có thể giải thích rõ hơn về câu hỏi, bởi vì là thực tế thì đang kết hợp rất là nhiều cái khác nhau vào trong một câu hỏi, nên là nó cũng gây ra một số khó khăn trong cái việc là hiểu. Và đặc biệt là khi mà đối với cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp bây giờ áp dụng cho một sản phẩm bảo hiểm nông nghiệp trên một cây trồng, cho một rủi ro, mình cũng đang rất là gặp nhiều khó khăn rồi, thì cái việc phân loại này nó cũng là gây ra rất là nhiều khó khăn. Thì nếu mà được thì anh sẽ mong anh là giải thích thêm cái câu hỏi của mình, thì chúng tôi sẽ bổ sung thêm. Anh
Vâng, xin cảm ơn ban tổ chức. Thì cái câu hỏi tôi đây muốn tìm hiểu cái kinh nghiệm các nước, vì như chúng ta biết bây giờ ví dụ như loại cây trồng có rất nhiều loại cây trồng mà chúng ta mới đang vừa anh Tình có trình bày về cây lúa chẳng hạn, chứ còn những loại cây khác thì
alo anh Phong ơi, bọn em đang không nghe được ạ. Anh có cái tiếng gì đấy như tiếng echo ở trong cái điện thoại của anh ạ.
dạ vâng.
Ok, anh.
Vâng, xin lỗi, cảm ơn ban tổ chức. Thì tôi có hỏi về câu hỏi như trên, thì vì là hiện nay ấy, vừa nãy nghe em trình bày về cái bảo hiểm cây lúa. Thế nhưng bây giờ ví dụ như ở trong ngành trồng trọt thì bây giờ có rất nhiều những cái loại cây trồng khác, một cái mức độ ảnh hưởng, mức độ tổn thất hay rủi ro gặp phải khác nhau. Thế thì bây giờ không thể xem xét cùng một cái mức loại bảo hiểm cho một cây trồng mà áp dụng tất cả các loại cây khác nhau được, hay con vật nuôi cũng vậy. Đơn giản ví dụ tôi mua một cái bảo hiểm của xe thôi, thì mỗi loại xe khác nhau thì nó lại sẽ là cái mức bảo hiểm khác nhau rồi. Đấy. Thì nhưng mà ở cái cùng một vụ tai nạn, cùng trong một cái tai nạn thì cái mỗi cây trồng nó sẽ gặp cái tổn thất khác nhau, thì không thể áp dụng chung được. Thì bây giờ kinh nghiệm các nước thì sẽ làm như nào ở trong việc xác định cái mức độ tổn thất để đền bù cho người nông dân. Vâng, xin hết ạ.
Xin mời Aquaculture.
Okay, sure. No, thanks for that clarification. That makes that's very clear now. So yeah, I think maybe to clarify a little bit here that I mean we are so you know the focus in the previous presentation was on the rice product, and then tomorrow we'll be going into some details on the livestock product and the aquaculture insurance product as well. Now, the reason we are focusing on these three products is because these are essentially the products which are, in scope currently, also related to the, the government decree and related to the premium subsidy, which is, in terms of the premium subsidy as well. So that's why we wanted to focus specifically on these three products. However, I think a lot of the content, so for example, if you, in the context of the presentation on the rice insurance product, a lot of the material will also be relevant for other crops. But of course, there are big differences as well. So obviously the product for rice will be very different to product for coffee, for example, and so on. So there are differences, but then currently in terms of the government decree related to the related to the specific insurance products which are in scope, is rice is the main crop which has been focused on. But generally, what happens in other countries is, again, you have very crop specific products. So there would be and it really depends on different factors. It can depend on the products which are within the national scheme. Even in national schemes, it may not cover all the products. They might focus on some specific products, or it might just relate to products for which there is a demand. So, for example, say in countries in Southern Africa, there's a lot of specific products for tobacco, for wheat, for maize, these kind of crops, because these are crops which are quite commercial in nature. There's a lot of commercial farming going on, and the commercial farmers take out insurance products. So they're very specific crop specific products which are there for commercial farmers. So basically the different crops will have different products, and in terms of the product design will be different, or even some of the and some of the product parameters will also be different. The pricing would also vary. So I think it should be a similar situation in Vietnam as well, if if other crops were also to be in scope.
Xin cảm ơn anh Tốt. Thực ra thì cái vấn đề này thì nó tương đối là phức tạp, và trong các cái thuật ngữ bảo hiểm nó có thuật ngữ về cái lựa chọn bất lợi, tức là nó không chỉ là sự khác biệt về giữa rủi ro với lại các cây trồng khác nhau ạ, mà nó khác biệt giữa các xã khác nhau cũng vậy. Chỉ cũng là cái rủi ro đấy, nhưng hai xã cạnh nhau là cái rủi ro đấy tác động khác nhau, và thậm chí là cái rủi ro đấy nó sẽ tác động khác nhau ở hai hộ là hàng xóm với nhau. Đấy là cái mà khái niệm chung thì gọi là lựa chọn bất lợi trong bảo hiểm ấy. Thì thực ra thì một phần nào đấy thì mình sẽ phải chấp nhận một cái phần nào đấy để mà sản phẩm bảo hiểm có thể hoạt động được. Ví dụ như là trên cùng một xã thì mình chỉ có thể là lấy ở cái mức bình quân thôi. Bởi vì cái tác động đối với hộ nghèo và hộ khá là nó sẽ khác nhau. Nó sẽ phức tạp đến cái mức đấy, chứ không chỉ là cái phức tạp đến cái chỉ là cái sự khác nhau giữa cây này hay cây kia đâu ạ. Nó sẽ còn các cái vấn đề sâu xa hơn nữa. Như vậy thì nhưng mà ở một cái mức độ nào đấy thì mình có thể chấp nhận một cái tỷ lệ rủi ro về lựa chọn bất lợi để làm sao cái sản phẩm bảo hiểm đấy có thể đi đến được phần lớn người dân. Đấy là cái mục đích cuối cùng của các cái doanh nghiệp bảo hiểm. Tiếp theo thì một cái câu hỏi, một cái nhận định của anh Thắng ở Bảo Việt, thì rất là cảm ơn anh về cái nhận định này. Cái thứ nhất đấy là cái bảo hiểm nông nghiệp sẽ có cơ hội phát triển nếu tập quán sản xuất hộ nhỏ lẻ chuyển nhanh sang tập trung quy mô lớn và áp dụng các cái quy trình công nghệ sản xuất hiện đại. Sản xuất nông hộ nhỏ sẽ khó khăn cho các cái công ty bảo hiểm trong việc khai bán và bồi thường. Thì cái này thì em hoàn toàn đồng ý với lại cái ý kiến của anh. Thực tế thì trong các cái đề xuất cho chính sách thì bọn tôi đề cập rất là nhiều đến cái vấn đề này. Tức là thực tế cái sản phẩm nông nghiệp chỉ có thể dễ dàng thành công được khi mà nó được định hướng theo thị trường. Và thị trường có nghĩa là các cái hộ nào mà có nhu cầu cao về sản phẩm nông nghiệp thì họ nên được ưu tiên mua sản phẩm nông nghiệp. Và rõ ràng cái hộ mà nhu cầu cao về sản phẩm nông nghiệp là các hộ quy mô lớn ở các cái vùng sản xuất hàng hóa và có các cái công nghệ, các áp dụng công nghệ, hay là một số các cái vùng mà sản xuất các cái mặt hàng có giá trị cao ấy, thì đấy mới là cái thị trường mà thị trường bảo hiểm nông nghiệp nên hướng tới. Tuy nhiên thì về mặt chính sách thì nó sẽ khác, bởi vì nhà nước thì quan tâm đến một số các cái vấn đề khác nữa. Thì cái đấy thì về mặt chính sách thì tôi sẽ giải thích về sau. Còn câu hỏi của anh liên quan đến dữ liệu là câu hỏi về dữ liệu của Tổng cục Thống kê thì có sẵn sàng chia sẻ hay không? Thì thực tế thì các cái dữ liệu của thống kê thì họ sẵn sàng chia sẻ thôi ạ. Có thể sẽ phải, nếu mà mình muốn có sớm thì có thể sẽ phải bỏ tiền để mua thì sẽ có sớm. Còn các cái dữ liệu public thì ví dụ như bây giờ là 2021 thì nó sẽ có dữ liệu đến 2019 thì mình có thể tìm. Các cái dữ liệu liên quan đến thời tiết ở Trung tâm Khí tượng Thủy văn cũng vậy, họ có thể chia sẻ, nhưng mà có thể thôi nhé, có thể mình sẽ phải mất một khoản phí để mua cái bộ dữ liệu đấy. Và cảm ơn anh rất là nhiều về câu hỏi. Thì đấy là cái câu trả lời của em. Thì anh Trần Mạnh Hải đến từ Học viện Nông nghiệp Việt Nam thì có một câu hỏi, chắc là câu này thì xin mời Tốt có thể trả lời. Đấy là cái thị trường bảo hiểm nói chung và bảo hiểm nông nghiệp nói riêng ở Việt Nam thì đang đối mặt với hai cái thất bại lớn. Cái thứ nhất là vấn đề là lựa chọn ngược hay là lựa chọn bất lợi. Và cái vấn đề thứ hai là rủi ro về mặt đạo đức. Theo chuyên gia thì có những cái khuyến nghị gì để mà giải quyết cái vấn đề này từ phía chính sách của chính phủ? Thì cái này xin mời anh Tốt có thể trình bày, trao đổi với lại tất cả mọi người. Xin cảm ơn.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. That's a really important question on the challenges of adverse selection and moral hazard. So obviously, yeah, those are, I mean, the two very big challenges, and there's not really an easy solution to either of them. But I mean, I'm just maybe, I mean, okay, maybe if we talk about each of them in terms, or maybe starting with adverse selection. So you're right. I think adverse selection is, it is a very key issue where the farmers who are higher risk will be, more likely to take up the product potentially. And also if farmers are aware of something which sometimes insurance companies may not be aware of. So you might have a higher proportion of the higher risk farmers taking up the product. And that, of course, also ends up making the product, of course, it can be loss making for the insurance companies, but it can also become more expensive for all the farmers, including the lower risk farmers. So there are different ways of addressing it. I mean, I'm not sure if all of them are uh, policy policy recommendations per se, but the different approaches to potentially addressing adverse selection. So, for example, and I'll try to use real examples as much as possible. So, for example, in some countries in the context of Africa and also in Asia, in general, with a lot of the some of the say major reinsurance companies like the likes of Swiss Re and others, they would actually have very strict cutoff dates in terms of deadlines by when the farmers would have to be enrolled for an insurance product. Yeah. So basically, having a deadline for sales is one way of avoiding adverse selection. I've seen for example, in Thailand a couple of years ago, there's a scheme there linked to the rice crop. Um, and in that scheme, the claims ratios are sometimes as high as in excess of 300, 400% for those farmers who have purchased the product on a voluntary basis, and they have bought the product almost when they know that the floods are going to take place. And that's to do with sometimes the sales are going on even as the season has started. So obviously, farmers who are already experiencing farms, or they know that there's a very high chance of floods taking place, they'll be tempted to buy the product. So it's possible to avoid those situations of adverse selection by having earlier cutoff date for sales. And another aspect, again, in the context of Thailand, from what we saw there, is that actually having the products on a bundled basis or also mandatory basis is better in a way of controlling adverse selection from that perspective. Because if farmers are receiving, say, the insurance product that has been packaged with the agricultural loan products, then they will also have to meet the eligibility criteria for the financial institution that is financing them. So that's another layer of due diligence which can be carried out on the farmers before they actually receive the loans together with the insurance product. Also, it's relatively unlikely that farmers will take out a loan only for the purpose of receiving an insurance payout that's linked to the loan. So there's if the products are typically being done on a purely voluntary basis, chances are that adverse selection is going to be higher than if it is on a mandatory or bundled basis, at least. There's a few elements there. Other ways is by having better risk clustering, so by defining different risk zones or different categories of farmers. That's another way of avoiding adverse selection. In having different premium rates for different categories of farmers. So those farmers who are in the higher risk category, maybe those who are only rainfall dependent, might attract a higher premium than those who have irrigation. Also having a continuity of cover. So this is also important. I think one of the comments made earlier that sometimes you have cases where farmers will only buy the product when they know that there is an insurance payout that they can expect. I think we saw this case in Ethiopia some time ago, that when the farmers usually know when it's going to be a good season and when it's a bad season. So when they know that it's going to be a drought year, the take-up rate is really high, but the next year the take-up rates are very low. So consistently the claims have always exceed premiums in the over the years. So anyway, so maybe there are also, from a policy perspective, maybe there should be an approach of having insurance on a multi-year basis, if that's possible to do, rather than having products which are purchased on a annual basis only. However, that might also be quite tricky to do because the same farmer may not be continuing the same crop every year. But that's one of the options. I think on moral hazard, some of these factors would also help in managing moral hazard. Also, having parametric or index products is a way of managing moral hazard. avoiding certain perils is also a way of controlling moral hazard. So, for example, if certain risks like pest and diseases, for specific pest and diseases which can be vaccinated against, for example, for livestock, maybe they should not be insured, because then that might encourage the farmer to not carry out those vaccinations. Um, yeah, and also having prerequisites or requirements for the, so in other words, good risk management practices which farmers have to carry out in order for them to be eligible for the insurance in the first place. Those can also be ways of managing moral hazard. But none of these solutions are easy to implement, but there could be options for addressing moral hazard and adverse selection as well.
Vâng, xin cảm ơn anh Kratos. Thực ra thì với ý kiến của tôi ấy, thì nó có mấy cái điểm cơ bản thôi. Thì ví dụ như lựa chọn ngược, nó vấn đề nó chỉ nguy hiểm khi mà cái 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 độ lớn của thị trường nó bé quá ấy. Tức nó vẫn còn bé thì cái đấy nó sẽ ảnh hưởng rất là nhiều. Nhưng mà khi mà cái thị trường nó đạt được đến một cái độ lớn mà đúng kỳ vọng ấy, thì các cái doanh nghiệp hoàn toàn có thể chấp nhận một phần tức là cái chênh lệch rủi ro giữa nhóm người này với nhóm người kia, bởi vì họ có thể bù đắp được. Thì cái đấy thì còn về rủi ro đạo đức thì về cơ bản thì có mấy cả phương án thôi, như anh Ao Tốt có bảo rồi, mình có thể áp dụng các cái công nghệ bảo hiểm khác nhau, đặc biệt là áp dụng công nghệ thì mình có thể xử lý được một số các vấn đề trong rủi ro về mặt đạo đức. Cái thứ hai nữa, mình cũng phải xây dựng cái hệ thống chính sách và pháp luật đủ tính định hướng và răn đe thì sẽ giảm được cái này. Và cái thứ ba là phải nâng cao ý thức của người dân trong cái vấn đề. Cho nên là thời gian gần đây thì Bộ trưởng Bộ Nông nghiệp có đề cập rất là nhiều đến cái vấn đề là nông nghiệp có trách nhiệm, đúng không? Thì những cái vấn đề nông nghiệp có trách nhiệm như vậy thì cũng có thể nâng cao được rủi ro và nâng cao được ý thức, tức là nâng cao được cái bên trong của người dân, và từ đấy giảm đi được những cái trục lợi về bảo hiểm. Thì tôi chỉ có một số ý kiến như vậy, bổ sung như vậy thôi. Thì hiện nay thì theo như chúng tôi nhận được thì đấy là câu hỏi cuối cùng. Anh Bùi Ngọc Thắng có hỏi thêm một câu là vậy thì Bộ Nông nghiệp có cơ sở dữ liệu không? Thực ra là có, Bộ Nông nghiệp cũng có, nhưng mà như lúc sáng tôi có đề cập thì cái tính chính xác và cái tính xác thực và cái bộ số liệu đấy có dùng được cho bảo hiểm hay không thì thì tất cả chúng ta sẽ phải xem xét lại cái bộ dữ liệu để xem là có dùng được không. Bởi vì cái đấy thì tôi cũng không thể cam đoan được. Mình sẽ phải có dữ liệu và mình sẽ phải check. Thì nếu mà anh có nhu cầu thì có thể liên hệ đến Bộ Nông nghiệp, thì chúng ta có thể xem xét cái bộ dữ liệu đấy xem như thế nào. Thì đấy là câu hỏi cuối cùng. Thì không biết là có ai có câu hỏi gì nữa không ạ? Nếu đấy là câu hỏi cuối cùng thì rất cảm ơn các anh các chị đã tham gia cái buổi tập huấn trong ngày hôm nay. Thì ngày mai theo chương trình thì mình sẽ bắt đầu từ 8:30 và tập trung vào một số các vấn đề liên quan đến kỹ thuật, liên quan đến kênh phân phối, liên quan đến một số các vấn đề pháp lý tại Việt Nam, và một số các cái câu hỏi thường gặp khi mà mình làm việc với người nông dân. Thì người nông dân người ta sẽ đặt ra những câu hỏi gì, cũng như là cái chiến lược đào tạo về bảo hiểm nông nghiệp như thế nào. Thì rất là cảm ơn các anh các chị đã tham dự cái lớp tập huấn trong ngày hôm nay, và rất là hy vọng là các anh các chị sẽ được gặp lại các anh các chị vào 8:30 ngày mai. Xin cảm ơn anh A Có Tốt rất là nhiều. Chắc bây giờ anh sẽ phải đi ngủ để bù, bởi vì anh sẽ thức từ 2 giờ sáng đến bây giờ. Bên kia bây giờ cũng không biết là mấy giờ. Cảm ơn anh A Có Tốt rất là nhiều, và xin chân thành cảm ơn tất cả các anh các chị, và hẹn gặp lại các anh các chị vào ngày mai, và có những cái chủ đề rất là thú vị vào ngày mai. Xin cảm ơn ạ.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Thanks. Okay, thanks. Bye. Bye.
Bắt cái này là gì nhỉ?
Lười à, to bắt.